Jessica had never imagined herself in a place like this, not in a million years. At 28, she was the youngest CEO in the company's history. She had inherited the multimillion-dollar corporation from her father, who had built the family business from the ground up. But it wasn't just the money or the title that had defined her. Jessica's legacy was about innovation, about taking risks where others were too scared to, about building something that stood the test of time. Follow the whole story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your opinion below in the comments section. It motivates us to share more impactful stories. But the Rivers Hotel wasn't standing tall anymore. She sat in her office, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the view of the city. The skyline stretched out in every direction, a testament to the power and success that had come before her. The view from her office had once filled her with pride, but lately, it only reminded her of the pressure weighing on her shoulders. In the last few months, the Rivers Hotel had seen a steady decline in its reputation. Staff complaints were rising, reviews were getting worse, and the balance sheets, well, those were a disaster. Jessica's thoughts turned to the meeting she had just had with her board members, the one where she had been given an ultimatum. Fix the hotel or sell it. Sell it. That thought twisted in her gut. The Rivers name meant something to her. It meant everything. Her father had trusted her to carry the family legacy forward, but she hadn't counted on how deeply the hotel was struggling. The once glamorous destination was now an afterthought in a city full of luxurious, new hotels. If she didn't act fast, Rivers Holdings could become just another faded memory. That's when the idea came to her. If the guests didn't care about the Rivers brand anymore, maybe she could understand why. She would go undercover. As the CEO, no one would ever suspect her. She could walk in, observe the employees, and learn what was really happening in the trenches. She stood up, pacing in front of her desk. Her father had never allowed her to work in the hotel's day-to-day operations. His philosophy had always been that the family business needed a strong hand at the top, someone who could make the hard decisions. But this wasn't about making decisions in a boardroom. This was about getting her hands dirty, about learning what had gone wrong from the ground up. She made up her mind. Later that day, she called in her assistant, Carla. "I need you to handle things here tomorrow," Jessica said. "I'm going to be away for a while. I'll be unreachable." Carla blinked in surprise, but nodded without questioning her boss. "Of course. Are you going on business?" "I need to see how things work at the hotel," Jessica said, trying to sound as nonchalant as possible. "I'll be out of the loop for a few days, but it's important. You'll be fine handling things here." Carla hesitated, but didn't argue. "All right. I'll keep everything in order." Jessica gave a faint smile. "Thanks, Carla." The next morning, she arrived at the Rivers Hotel before dawn. She stood outside the glass doors, feeling an odd mix of anticipation and anxiety. This was it, the first step in a dangerous game. The kind of game that could risk everything, if she wasn't careful. The hotel's sleek, modern exterior gleamed in the early morning light, but Jessica knew better than to be fooled by appearances. She had seen the slip-ups, the cracks in the walls. But today, those cracks were hers to explore. Inside, she approached the HR desk with a new identity, Melanie Turner, a temporary hire for housekeeping. The receptionist, a woman named Angela, smiled warmly at her and handed her a name tag. "Welcome to Rivers Hotel, Melanie. We've been short-staffed, so we really appreciate your help." Jessica nodded, taking a deep breath. The mask she wore felt heavier than it had any right to. "Thanks. I'll do my best," she said, trying to sound as normal as possible. The receptionist handed her a schedule. "Your shift starts in 30 minutes. Head upstairs to meet the supervisor, Mark, on the 5th floor. He'll tell you what needs to be done." As Jessica walked toward the elevator, her pulse quickened. The sound of the elevator dinged as it reached her floor, and she stepped off into the hallway. It was a completely different world from her office on the top floor. The narrow hallways were a stark contrast to the luxury suites she had once proudly walked through. The lighting was dim, and the carpets had seen better days. When she reached room 501, she found Mark, a burly man in his 40s with a permanent frown on his face. He didn't greet her warmly or with any sense of enthusiasm, just a quick nod. "You're Melanie, right?" Mark asked, his voice gruff. "Yes," Jessica replied, her hands slightly trembling under the cleaning gloves she had put on. "All right," he said, handing her a clipboard. "You've got 3 rooms to clean today. Let's see how fast you can go." Jessica took the clipboard, feeling the weight of it as if it were a heavy burden. As she walked into the first room, her heart sank. The room was messy. Sheets thrown about, trash in the corners, the remnants of food on the counter. It was nothing like the pristine, 5-star suites she was used to managing. She started to clean, scrubbing the sink and folding the sheets. The hours blurred together as she moved from room to room. By lunchtime, her back ached, and her fingers were sore from the endless tasks. The hotel was far from the luxury it claimed to be. The employees were overworked, the guests were demanding, and the money to fix things just wasn't there. It wasn't long before Jessica realized just how deep the problems ran. There were disgruntled staff everywhere, each of them dealing with their own issues. She caught snippets of their conversations, stories of long hours, unappreciative managers, and the constant struggle to keep up with the demands of the job. The hotel was a mess, yes, but it wasn't just the rooms or the guests. It was the culture, the way the employees were treated, the way the whole system seemed to be falling apart piece by piece. At lunchtime, Jessica sat in the back of the staff cafeteria, eating a bland sandwich and overhearing more complaints. There was a constant sense of frustration in the air. It was clear that no one was happy with how things were being run. As she sat there, a young woman in a black uniform with a name tag reading Emma sat down next to her. She gave Jessica a brief, friendly smile. "You look new," Emma remarked. "First day?" Jessica nodded, trying her best to blend in. "Yeah, just trying to get the hang of things." Emma raised an eyebrow. "It's not easy here. Things are kind of rough, but you'll get used to it." Jessica took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her disguise. She didn't just have to get used to it. She had to fix it. As she stood up to head back to her duties, she felt the first real spark of determination. It wasn't just about making changes from the top. It was about truly understanding what was going wrong at the bottom. And Jessica Rivers wasn't going to stop until she did. By the end of her first day at the Rivers Hotel, Jessica felt more exhausted than she had in months. Her muscles ached from hours of scrubbing. Her eyes were bloodshot from staring at grimy countertops, and the sensation of standing on her feet all day was one she hadn't experienced since she was a teenager. Back then, it had been a summer job at a fast food restaurant. Now, it was her first step into a world she'd been desperately trying to avoid. A world where the empire she had inherited was crumbling beneath her feet. As she stepped into the hotel's dimly lit staff locker room, she felt an unfamiliar exhaustion in her bones. The constant buzz of activity around her had never felt this overwhelming, not even during corporate meetings or high-stakes boardroom negotiations. But she couldn't stop now. She couldn't just walk away. She needed to know the truth. Jessica had barely changed into her jeans and t-shirt when Emma, the young hotel worker from the cafeteria, walked in. Her face was flushed, as if she had just run a marathon. "You survived the first day, huh?" Emma asked, her tone light, but there was an undercurrent of concern behind her words. "Barely," Jessica replied, giving a tired laugh. "I don't think I've worked this hard in years." Emma sat down beside her at a locker, pulling her hair into a messy bun. "Welcome to the real Rivers. It's not glamorous, but it's where we live. I don't know what you were expecting, but it's been like this for months. Everyone's trying to hold it together, but it's getting harder." Jessica's gaze softened. "What do you mean, harder?" Emma exhaled, staring at her worn-out work shoes. "I don't know. The hotel's always been kind of underfunded, you know? A lot of people don't want to say it, but the money just isn't there like it used to be. Guests are leaving bad reviews. Staff turnover is up, and we're expected to do more with less. But upper management doesn't want to hear it. They just keep pushing us to work harder." Jessica's mind raced as she took in Emma's words. Was this the result of bad decision-making, or was there something else going on? "I'm here to make things better," Jessica said quietly, more to herself than to Emma. Emma raised an eyebrow, but there was a touch of skepticism in her expression. "And how are you going to do that? They've been saying that for years, and nothing's changed. If you ask me, we're just trying to keep our heads above water." Before Jessica could respond, the door to the locker room opened. A tall man in a crisp uniform walked in, Mark, the supervisor from earlier. His eyes scanned the room, then settled on Emma. Hey, I need you on the floor, he barked. We've got a VIP coming in soon, and I need the room ready. No excuses. Emma rolled her eyes, but stood up without a word. All right, she muttered, turning to Jessica. I'll see you tomorrow. Just keep your head down. It's a war zone out there. As Emma left, Jessica stared at the empty chair for a moment. She wasn't blind. She could see the cracks in the foundation. Emma was right. People were just trying to survive. But Jessica didn't have the luxury of merely surviving. She had to turn this place around. Her mind was racing, piecing together the different fragments of her undercover experience. The staff was overworked, underpaid, and clearly disillusioned. The manager, Mark, was tight-lipped, distant, and seemingly uninterested in their well-being. And despite her best efforts, no one was talking about the root cause of the problem. But what if it wasn't just poor management? Jessica shook her head. She had a sinking feeling that this was much deeper than simple mismanagement. The next morning, she decided to dig deeper. She wasn't just going to clean rooms and talk to the staff. She needed to understand what was happening behind closed doors, the decisions, the budgets, and the motivations of the people at the very top. And so, she made a plan. She would meet with each department head under the guise of offering support and guidance, but in reality, she was searching for answers. As the elevator doors slid open on the 5th floor, Jessica walked toward the housekeeping office with her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. This was the moment she had been preparing for. Mark was sitting at a desk, chatting with one of the other workers. He looked up as Jessica entered. "You wanted to talk?" he asked, his tone neutral. "Yes," she said, taking a seat across from him. "I was hoping to get a better sense of the operations here. I've noticed there are some issues. Some rooms are left behind, and there are complaints piling up. I need to know what's going wrong." Mark leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Look, I've been here a long time. This hotel has always had its problems. The people who run this place don't give us the resources we need, but we make do with what we've got." Jessica could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken frustrations just beneath the surface. "What do you mean by make do?" she asked carefully. "What do you need?" Mark hesitated. It was clear he wasn't used to being asked these kinds of questions. "Staffing, for one. We're stretched thin. There's not enough time or people to do everything. The guests complain about things that could be fixed with just a little more help. But it's not like we have the luxury of hiring more people. The budget's been slashed." Jessica listened intently. Slashed budgets, understaffing, poor management. These weren't just complaints. They were symptoms of a larger problem, one that couldn't be fixed with a simple change in leadership. The conversation with Mark was eye-opening, but it still wasn't enough. Jessica needed to know more about the finances of the hotel. She needed access to the real numbers, the ones no one was willing to talk about. Later that afternoon, she wandered through the staff hallways and headed to the office of the hotel's accountant, Janet. As she approached the door, she heard raised voices inside. "I told you we don't have the money for that." Janet's voice was sharp. Jessica hesitated, unsure if she should knock. But before she could decide, the door opened. Janet, a woman in her late 40s, stood there with a scowl on her face. "Can I help you?" she asked curtly. Jessica smiled politely. "Hi, I'm Melanie Turner. I just wanted to check in with you about the budget. I've been hearing some concerns about the finances and wanted to see if I could help in any way." Janet paused, eyeing her suspiciously. Then she sighed, stepping aside. "I suppose you can come in, but I'm not sure what you think you can do about it." Jessica walked in, her heart racing. This was her chance. Jessica stepped into Janet's cluttered office, her mind already racing. The accountant's desk was piled high with spreadsheets, invoices, and unopened envelopes, but it was the filing cabinet in the corner of the room that held Jessica's focus. That was where the answers were. Janet's eyes followed her every move, and Jessica could feel the weight of her gaze, skeptical and cautious. "All right, what's all this about?" Janet asked, crossing her arms. "You want to know about the budget? What good is it going to do? You can't fix what's broken here. Believe me." Jessica smiled, trying to put Janet at ease. "I'm just here to help. I know things aren't easy right now, and I've heard a lot of complaints from staff. I was hoping you could show me the numbers. Maybe there's something I can do to fix it. I'm not here to make things worse." Janet sighed, clearly unconvinced. But after a long pause, she motioned to the chair across from her desk. "Sit down then," she said. "But don't say I didn't warn you. You won't like what you see." Jessica sat, her fingers tapping against her knee as she waited for Janet to pull up the files. The accountant clicked through her computer, pulling up a series of documents. The numbers filled the screen: income statements, expenditure reports, projections, and budgets. Jessica's stomach tightened as she began to read. The hotel was losing money. Fast. The revenue had been steadily dropping over the past 2 years, and while expenses had increased, the budget had remained stagnant. There were irregularities, payments made to vendors that seemed unusually high, contracts that didn't make sense, and an overall lack of investment in the hotel itself. But the most shocking thing was the line item labeled Special Projects Fund. "What is this?" Jessica asked, pointing to the section that listed hundreds of thousands of dollars in unaccounted expenses under the vague heading of Special Projects. Janet hesitated, looking around the room as if checking for spies. That's a tricky one. It's not what it looks like, okay? Not what it looks like?" Jessica repeated, leaning forward. "These are massive amounts of money. What exactly is going on here, Janet?" Janet opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, her expression torn. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. The air was thick with tension, and Jessica could see the hesitation in the older woman's eyes. Finally, Janet sighed, rubbing her temples. "Fine," she muttered. "You want to know the truth? The hotel's in debt. We've been borrowing money from the owner's personal accounts just to keep the lights on. And that Special Projects Fund, it's just a cover for the real costs. It's all going into their pockets." Jessica's pulse quickened. "Their pockets? Who are you talking about?" Janet shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "The owners, the higher-ups. They've been siphoning funds for personal expenses, rebranding the hotel with fancy logos, and things that don't make any sense for the budget. They've been investing in things like redesigning rooms that are half empty instead of maintaining the building. And they keep talking about expansion, about opening more locations. But I don't see how that's even possible with what's left in the bank." Jessica could feel her blood begin to boil as the pieces fell into place. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was theft. The owners had been draining the company dry while pretending things were fine, and everyone below them was left to pick up the pieces. "I can't believe this," Jessica whispered, more to herself than to Janet. "How has no one noticed?" "They have," Janet replied quietly, "but no one's willing to say anything. The board knows, but they don't want to rock the boat. It's all hush-hush. Everyone's afraid of losing their job." Jessica clenched her jaw, her mind racing. She had been prepared for bad news, but this was worse than she could have imagined. "I need to see the full records," Jessica said firmly. "I need to see the transfer logs, the contracts, everything. This hotel is being bled dry, and I can't let that happen." Janet shook her head, glancing nervously at the door. "You don't get it, do you? If you go digging, you'll get yourself fired. They don't take kindly to people questioning them, especially someone like you." Jessica's eyebrows furrowed. "Someone like me?" "You know what I mean," Janet said, her tone a little defensive. "Someone who's not supposed to be here. Someone from the outside. They're not going to let you get away with this. Trust me, it's not worth it." Jessica didn't back down. "I didn't come here to play it safe. If I don't do something, this place will fall apart, and no one will even know why." Janet's expression softened, just for a moment. She seemed to consider something before pulling open a drawer in her desk and retrieving a thick folder. "Fine," she said, handing it over. "But if you get caught, don't say I didn't warn you." Jessica took the folder with a nod of thanks, tucking it under her arm as she stood. "I won't, but I have to know the truth." As she left Janet's office and headed back down the hallway, Jessica's mind was whirling. The path ahead was clear now. There was no turning back. She couldn't ignore the corruption, the lies, and the greed that had been festering in the heart of the Rivers Hotel. She was determined to expose it. But the deeper she went, the more dangerous it would become. Jessica knew that. Still, She couldn't let that stop her. The hotel was hers to save, or to destroy. And Jessica Turner wasn't about to back down. The next morning, Jessica sat at her desk, the folder Janet had handed her now spread out before her. The numbers on the pages blurred together as she tried to make sense of it all, but the truth was there, right in front of her. The hotel was in financial turmoil, and the owners were the ones pulling the strings, siphoning funds and hiding the evidence. But as she flipped through the papers, one thing became increasingly clear. Jessica was not alone in her discovery. There were several lines in the financial statements marked in red, notes scribbled in the margins, things that looked like warnings. Someone else had seen what was happening. She leaned in closer, squinting at a line item dated just 6 months earlier, transfer to account number 4321, confidential project, owner's expense. The amount was astronomical, and it was listed as an investment in a new luxury division. But Jessica knew that no such division existed. Not in the real world, at least. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she realized something. This wasn't just mismanagement. It was deliberate. The owners had gone to great lengths to make their actions look legitimate, using fake projects and inflated invoices to hide the money they were stealing. As Jessica pondered what to do next, her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking her focus. She picked it up and saw a text message from an unknown number. "I know what you're looking at. Be careful." Her pulse quickened. She glanced around her office, but the door was closed, and there was no one else in the hallway. Who could it be? Janet? Someone else from the inside? Whoever it was, they knew about the investigation, and they were watching her. Before she could respond, the phone buzzed again. "Meet me at the alley behind the hotel at 3 p.m. Come alone." The message was chilling in its simplicity, and for a moment, Jessica considered ignoring it. But deep down, she knew she couldn't. Whoever this was had information, maybe even more than she did. They could be the key to uncovering the full extent of the corruption. But there was a risk. What if it was a trap? What if the owners had caught wind of her investigation and were trying to intimidate her into backing off? As the clock ticked toward 3 p.m., Jessica's mind raced with possibilities. She had to go. There was too much at stake. But she also had to be smart. She couldn't go in unprepared. At 2:45, she slipped out of her office, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway was eerily quiet as she made her way to the back exit. She kept her head down, hoping no one would see her. The last thing she needed was to attract attention. When she reached the alley behind the hotel, the first thing she noticed was how dark it was. The overhead lights flickered, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. The alley was empty, eerily so. Jessica stood there for a moment, her breath shallow, her senses heightened. Then, she heard footsteps. They were soft at first, the sound of shoes tapping lightly against the ground, but growing louder as they approached. Jessica spun around, her eyes scanning the shadows. A man emerged from the darkness, his features hidden beneath the brim of a baseball cap. His face was obscured by a scarf, but there was something about him that made Jessica feel like he wasn't a stranger. "You came," the man said in a low, gravelly voice. "Good." Jessica didn't speak right away. She studied him, her instincts on high alert. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest. The man hesitated, then pulled down the scarf just enough to reveal his face. Jessica's stomach dropped. It was Kevin, the head of security for the hotel. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her pulse quickening. "Are you the one sending these messages?" Kevin nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I had to be sure you were serious before I said anything. There are people in this hotel who don't want the truth to come out. People who will do anything to protect their interests." "Who?" Jessica asked. "Who's behind this?" Kevin glanced around nervously before stepping closer, lowering his voice. "You don't know what you're dealing with. These owners, they're not who they seem to be. They've got connections, people who can make problems disappear. I've seen them do it." Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean, make problems disappear?" Kevin took a deep breath, his eyes darting to the alley entrance. "They've been using this hotel as a front for all kinds of illegal activity. Money laundering, trafficking, you name it. And if you keep digging, they'll make sure you disappear, too." Jessica's mind spun. She had suspected something shady was going on, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. The owners weren't just greedy, they were dangerous. "What can I do?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "How do I stop them?" Kevin hesitated again. "You can't do it alone, but I can help. I've been gathering information, things that could bring them down. But it's risky, very risky. If they catch wind of it—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Jessica understood. The stakes were higher than ever, and now there was no turning back. "I'm in," she said, her voice firm. "Whatever it takes." Kevin nodded. "All right, I'll get you the evidence you need. But you have to be careful. They'll be watching you now, and you can't trust anyone." As Kevin turned and disappeared back into the shadows, Jessica's heart pounded in her chest. The walls were closing in. She had no choice but to go deeper into the rabbit hole. But now, she had an ally, a shadow in the dark who might just be her ticket to bringing down the corrupt owners and saving the hotel. But with every step forward, the danger grew, and Jessica wasn't sure how much longer she could keep her balance in the face of it. The next few days were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Jessica's office felt colder than usual, the weight of the investigation pressing down on her with every passing hour. Kevin had been in touch only sporadically, always cautious, always watching his back. She had been expecting a phone call from him, but when it finally came, the urgency in his voice sent a chill straight to her core. "Jessica, meet me in the parking garage after work," he said. "I've got something you need to see." "Is it safe?" she asked, her mind already racing with worst-case scenarios. "There's no time to explain. Just trust me," Kevin replied before hanging up abruptly. As the afternoon dragged on, Jessica couldn't focus. Her mind was fixated on the words Kevin had spoken. "Trust me." She didn't know if she should, not after everything she'd learned about the owners and the criminal network they seemed to be tied to. But something about his tone made it impossible to ignore. When the clock struck 5 p.m., she gathered her things, trying to act normal as she headed for the parking garage. The hotel lobby was crowded as usual, and no one seemed to notice her slip out the back exit. The garage was dimly lit, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering overhead as Jessica moved toward her car. She could feel her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Each step felt heavier than the last as she approached the dark corner where she and Kevin had agreed to meet. There, standing under the faint glow of a single light bulb, Kevin was waiting for her. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket, his posture tense, his eyes darting around nervously. "You're late," he said, his voice low. "Sorry," Jessica replied, trying to steady her breath. "What's going on? What have you found?" Kevin didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled out a thick envelope from inside his coat and handed it to her. "Everything you need is in here," he said. "Bank records, documents, photos, proof that the owners are laundering money through this hotel. You won't find a cleaner trail." Jessica's hands trembled as she took the envelope from him. She could feel the weight of it in her palms, the evidence of a corrupt empire waiting to be uncovered. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kevin's face hardened. "Because I'm tired of watching good people get hurt. You have no idea how deep this goes, Jessica. The owners, they're untouchable. They've got lawyers, cops, even politicians in their pockets. The only way to take them down is to hit them where it hurts." Jessica nodded, her mind racing. She had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. "So, what's the plan?" she asked, slipping the envelope into her bag. "First, you need to take this to a lawyer," Kevin said. "Someone you can trust. Not your hotel's legal team. They're in on it. You need to go outside the system. Once we've got the evidence in the right hands, we can start building a case." Jessica hesitated. "I don't know who to trust. I've seen how deep this goes. What if the lawyer is compromised, too?" Kevin's eyes narrowed. "If you want to take these guys down, you're going to have to take risks. But don't worry, I've got you covered. I know a few people who can help you. But you have to keep your head down. The moment you make a move, they'll come for you." Her heart skipped a beat. "Come for me? What do you mean?" Kevin stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The owners don't play around. They have people who can make your life a living hell. If they think you're a threat, They won't hesitate to destroy you. Jessica shivered at the thought. She had known the stakes were high, but hearing Kevin's warning made it feel real, like the danger wasn't just something she read about in the news. It was standing right in front of her. "I'm not backing down," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "I have to do this. I have to take them down." Kevin gave her a long, hard look before nodding. "You've got guts, Jessica. I respect that. But remember, there's no turning back once you do this. It's all or nothing." The sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the garage, and Kevin's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the area. "Go," he said urgently. "Now. We'll talk later. Don't make a scene." Jessica didn't hesitate. She turned on her heel and sprinted toward her car, her heart hammering in her chest. As she drove out of the garage, she glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone tailing her. But the road behind her was empty. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. Jessica followed Kevin's advice, taking the envelope to a lawyer who had a reputation for handling high-stakes cases. After a tense meeting in a small, nondescript office on the outskirts of town, the lawyer, an older man named Robert Sinclair, promised to help her. But he was careful. Too careful. "You need to lay low," he told her. "The moment you start shaking things up, you'll be on their radar. And once they know you're onto them, they'll stop at nothing to protect themselves." Jessica nodded, though her thoughts were clouded with worry. She had the evidence. She had a lawyer willing to fight. But she also knew what Kevin had said was true. If the owners felt threatened, they wouldn't hesitate to silence her. And that's when it hit her. This was bigger than her. It wasn't just about the hotel or the money. It was about exposing a network that reached far beyond the walls of this one building. If she succeeded, the entire foundation of corruption might come crashing down. But if she failed, she didn't want to think about what would happen next. The days that followed were filled with a strange mix of unease and determination. Jessica's life, once predictable and mundane, had morphed into something unrecognizable. Every decision, every move, felt loaded with risk. She couldn't help but feel the weight of the envelope in her bag, a constant reminder of the danger that loomed just beyond her doorstep. She spent her nights reading through the documents Kevin had given her, piecing together the threads of corruption, bribery, and money laundering that snaked through the hotel's operations. The scope of it was staggering. Offshore accounts, secret transactions, and names she recognized from the city's upper echelons of power. The owners weren't just rich, they were untouchable, surrounded by a fortress of influence. But none of that mattered. She had made her decision. She was going to expose them, no matter the cost. The lawyer, Robert Sinclair, had been clear. She needed to be cautious, lay low, and wait for the right moment to strike. He advised her to document everything, keep a low profile at work, and avoid drawing attention to herself. In the meantime, he was working on a strategy to approach law enforcement, but even he acknowledged that the police might be compromised. It was going to take more than just evidence to take down a network this powerful. Jessica couldn't afford to wait for the right moment forever. Every day that passed felt like one more chance for the owners to cover their tracks, one more chance for them to silence her before she could even make a move. She had to act, and soon. That morning, she arrived at the hotel early. It was still dark outside, the sky a pale gray, with the promise of rain hanging in the air. She parked her car in the underground garage and walked through the back entrance of the hotel, making sure to slip past the lobby unnoticed. Her shift didn't officially start for another hour, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. As she walked down the corridor to the employee break room, she passed the office of the general manager, Laura Turner. The door was slightly ajar, and Jessica could hear muffled voices from within. It was rare for Laura to be at work this early, but Jessica didn't think much of it until she heard a name. "Kevin Moore," Laura's voice said, sharp and insistent. Jessica froze in her tracks. "Kevin Moore? Are you sure?" a second voice asked, a man's voice. It sounded familiar, though she couldn't place it. "Positive," Laura replied. "He's been meeting with Jessica, and I've seen him around the hotel more than once. I don't trust him." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She quickly turned away, retreating back down the hall, her mind racing. She had suspected that Kevin's involvement with her had raised eyebrows among the hotel's management, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through her bones. They knew about Kevin. They knew about her. The implications were terrifying. She rushed to the break room, trying to steady her breathing. Her pulse was racing. Was it possible that Kevin had been compromised? Or was it something even worse, that they had known about him all along, that he was a part of their web, too? A cold sweat broke out on her forehead as she sat down, trying to calm herself. There was no way to know for sure. But one thing was clear. If they were on to her and Kevin, things were about to get much worse. Minutes later, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She looked at the screen and saw a message from Kevin. "Don't trust anyone. They know about you. They know about me." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She quickly typed a response, her fingers shaking. "What do we do now?" The reply came almost instantly. "We keep moving. I'll meet you tonight. Be careful." Jessica's mind was reeling. What did Kevin mean by keep moving? Was he planning to leave town? Or was he setting up some kind of counterattack? She didn't have time to process it. She had to focus on what was happening right now, on the fact that her every move was being watched. She spent the rest of the day on high alert, her every interaction with the hotel staff feeling like a potential trap. She couldn't trust anyone, not even her closest colleagues. Laura Turner, the general manager, was the most suspicious of them all. Her early morning conversation had confirmed that she was onto something, and now Jessica had to wonder just how far Laura's loyalty went. At the end of her shift, Jessica walked to her car with a knot in her stomach. She had just stepped outside when she heard a voice call out to her from behind. "Jessica?" She spun around, her heart racing. A man in a suit stood at the entrance of the hotel, his face familiar but his name elusive. He wasn't someone she spoke to regularly, but she recognized him as a member of the hotel's upper management. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was just wondering if you could come by my office tomorrow morning. We need to talk about something," the man said, his expression unreadable. Jessica's instincts flared. She didn't trust him, didn't trust anyone in the hotel's management anymore. But she couldn't afford to turn down a direct invitation. "Sure," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "I'll stop by." The man smiled faintly. "Great. We'll see you then." As Jessica drove home that evening, her mind was whirling. She had a sinking feeling that whatever was waiting for her tomorrow was going to change everything. Kevin had warned her that things were about to get dangerous. But this felt like something even worse. The walls were closing in, and she had no idea who she could trust. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, one thought kept running through her mind. How far would they go to protect their secrets? The night before her meeting with the mysterious hotel executive was restless. Jessica tossed and turned in bed, her thoughts spiraling into a whirlwind of doubt and fear. It was as though the hotel had become a prison, its walls closing in around her, each hallway a potential trap. She could feel the eyes on her every time she walked through the lobby, every time she passed a camera. It didn't matter how carefully she tried to hide. Someone was always watching. By the time morning came, the weight of the night's anxiety had settled deep in her bones. She felt exhausted, both mentally and physically, but there was no room for rest. Not anymore. Jessica arrived at the hotel early, as she always did, trying to stay ahead of the curve. She parked her car in the same underground garage and walked through the back entrance, determined to keep a low profile. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow on the empty hallways. As she approached the office of the man who had called her the previous evening, her stomach churned. The last thing she wanted was to get involved in another tangled web of deception. But she had no choice. She needed answers. And she needed them now. She knocked on the door lightly and heard a muffled, "Come in," from the other side. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The man who had called her the night before was sitting behind a large desk, a stack of papers in front of him. He didn't stand up when she entered, but there was something about the way he looked at her, cool, calculating, that made her skin crawl. "Ms. Owens," he said with a tight smile. "Thanks for coming." "I'm not sure what this is about," Jessica replied, her voice steady but cautious. "What did you want to talk about?" The man, who introduced himself as Jonathan West, motioned for her to take a seat. "It's a sensitive matter," Something that needs to be handled delicately. I think you know what I'm referring to. Jessica's pulse quickened. There was no way he could know. Could he? She hadn't told anyone. Only Kevin knew the full extent of her investigation. She had made sure to be careful, not to draw attention to herself. I don't know what you mean, she said, forcing the words out as calmly as possible. West leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You're working with Kevin Moore, aren't you? Her heart skipped a beat. The name sent a shockwave of panic through her. She had been so careful, so meticulous in hiding her connection to Kevin. How had they found out? I don't know what you're talking about, Jessica said again, but this time her voice trembled slightly. She couldn't hide her fear. West didn't seem fazed. I'm not here to cause trouble, Jessica. I'm here to help. You've been very careful, but we both know that this is getting out of hand. We can't let it go any further. Jessica's mind raced, trying to figure out her next move. How much did he know? What are you saying? She asked, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. I'm saying that you need to back off. You're digging too deep. And if you don't, if you continue down this path, you're going to regret it. Jessica's blood ran cold. This was it. This was the warning. They had figured her out, and now they were trying to intimidate her into silence. Who are you? She demanded. And why are you threatening me? Jonathan West's expression remained unfazed. I'm a concerned party. Let's just say I have a vested interest in ensuring that certain things stay under wraps. The owners of this hotel? They don't take kindly to people like you snooping around. I'm giving you a chance to walk away before things get really ugly. Jessica's mind was racing. She couldn't back down. Not now, not after everything she'd uncovered. She had already come too far. But she also knew the kind of power the hotel's owners wielded. If they were willing to go to these lengths to intimidate her, how far would they go to stop her? Would they silence her permanently? I'm not afraid of you, she said, her voice gaining strength despite the rising tide of fear in her chest. And I'm not backing off. I'm not going to let you or anyone else stop me from doing what's right. West's smile faded. For a moment, he was silent, staring at her, sizing her up as if weighing the consequences of her defiance. You'll regret this, he said quietly, almost as an afterthought. Then, without another word, he stood up and walked to the door. He opened it and turned back to face her. Think it over, Jessica, he said, his voice low and threatening. We'll be in touch. With that, he left the room, leaving her to stare at the closed door in stunned silence. Jessica sat there for several moments, trying to steady her breathing. The reality of what she had just heard sank in. She had been threatened, directly. And yet, in some twisted way, it only solidified her resolve. They were scared. Scared of what she might uncover. Scared of the truth she was about to expose. But she couldn't ignore the feeling of dread gnawing at her. The walls were closing in, and there was no way to know who could be trusted anymore. Could Kevin have set her up? Was this all part of a bigger game? She had no answers, only questions. And with every passing minute, the stakes were rising. As she walked back to the break room, her mind raced. She couldn't ignore this warning, but she couldn't back down either. One thing was clear. Her investigation had just gone from dangerous to life-threatening. Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Even though the hotel was bustling with guests, and the employees seemed focused on their own tasks, every time she turned a corner or entered a room, it felt as though a pair of eyes followed her. It was the kind of feeling you get when someone is standing just behind you, but when you turn around, there's no one there. She couldn't afford to ignore it. She had already made a powerful enemy, and the warning from Jonathan West lingered in the back of her mind, heavy and suffocating. The threat was real, and she couldn't pretend otherwise. She had to be more careful than ever. Her first instinct was to go to Kevin, to ask him if he knew anything more about this strange warning. But after the last conversation they'd had, she wasn't sure she could trust him anymore. His behavior had been erratic lately, and something about his demeanor had shifted. She had seen the way he looked at her when she'd mentioned the hotel's owners, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. It could have been fear, or guilt, or something darker. But now was not the time for second-guessing. If she was going to make it through this, she needed a plan. One that didn't involve relying on anyone else. Especially not Kevin. She took a deep breath and stepped into the back office, where she had been working on the hotel's financial records. The documents, though mostly mundane, had started to reveal some irregularities, some discrepancies that didn't add up. The kind of things she would have overlooked a few weeks ago. But now, everything was connected. Her eyes scanned the room for the stacks of paper that were supposed to be her main focus. But as soon as she opened the file cabinet, something caught her eye. A manila envelope was tucked into the back corner of the drawer. An envelope that shouldn't have been there. It was strange. The envelope was thick, but its contents were soft, and there was no label, no indication of who it belonged to. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled it out. This was no ordinary envelope. Whatever was inside, it was important. She set it on the desk and opened it carefully, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, there were several pieces of paper, all neatly stacked. But it wasn't the papers themselves that made her pause. It was the names and figures written on them. The documents contained what looked like payment records, large sums of money being transferred to untraceable offshore accounts. The names weren't familiar to her, but the scale of the transactions was enough to make her blood run cold. This was no ordinary financial mismanagement. This was money laundering, at a scale that would make international headlines. Her mind raced as she examined the documents. The amounts were astronomical, and they had been going on for years. But what truly unsettled her was the fact that the hotel's owners were connected to these accounts. The signatures, although illegible, were unmistakably tied to people she had encountered in the past. She leaned back in her chair, trying to steady her breathing. This was bigger than she had imagined. And it was no longer just about the hotel. It was about a network of corruption that stretched far beyond the walls of this place. As she stared at the papers, she heard a faint sound, footsteps in the hallway outside. Her heart leapt in her chest. She quickly shoved the documents back into the envelope and tucked it into her bag, barely getting it closed before the door to the office opened. Jessica froze, her hands still on her bag. It was Kevin. "Hey," he said, his voice unusually low. He stepped into the room, looking around as though he was searching for something. "You okay? You looked off." "I'm fine," she replied quickly, standing up from her chair and adjusting her clothes. She tried to act natural, but her pulse was racing. "Just a little tired, I guess." Kevin looked at her, his eyes narrowing as though he could see right through her facade. "You sure? You seem tense. More than usual." Jessica swallowed, forcing herself to smile. "It's nothing. Just, the usual stress." For a moment, Kevin didn't say anything. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with a shrug, he turned to leave the room. "All right," he said, his voice soft. "But if you need to talk, I'm here." Before she could respond, he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and Jessica let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking, and she could feel the weight of the envelope pressing against her side. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not now. Not with Kevin. She didn't trust him anymore, not fully. And she couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. She glanced at the clock. It was already late in the day, and the hotel was preparing for another busy evening. She had to move quickly. But just as she turned to grab her bag and leave the office, she heard something that made her blood run cold. A sound that made her freeze in place. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing in the hallway outside her office door. Jessica turned toward the door, her heart thudding in her chest. There was no way it was Kevin again. He had left. She could feel the tension building, a heaviness in the air that seemed to grow with every passing second. She reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling. Whoever was out there, whoever was walking toward her office, was not someone she wanted to meet. With one final, deep breath, she flung open the door. Standing in the hallway was a man she didn't recognize. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his presence was unmistakable. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a black suit that blended into the dim lighting of the corridor. His eyes, though, were what unsettled her the most. They were cold, calculating, and seemed to pierce right through her. Without a word, he stepped forward, blocking her way. "Jessica Owens," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I think we need to talk." Jessica's breath caught in her throat as the man stepped forward, his presence imposing, his eyes never leaving hers. For a moment, the hallway seemed to stretch and warp around her, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The sound of her heartbeat was the only thing she could hear, thudding in her ears. She instinctively took a step back, her mind racing to process the situation. Who was this guy? What did he want with her? Her fingers brushed against the edge of the doorframe as she tried to gather herself. There was something about his stillness, the way he stood there like a shadow, that sent a chill down her spine. I don't know who you are, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Her mind flashed to the envelope in her bag, the one with the incriminating documents inside. Was this man connected to the money laundering she had uncovered? Was he here to silence her before she could expose everything? The man's lips twitched into the faintest of smirks. You'll know soon enough. But first, I need you to come with me. His voice was calm, eerily so. There was no threat in his words, but the menace was there, hanging in the air like an unspoken promise. He wasn't asking. He was telling her. Jessica's instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. She had to think, had to buy herself some time. Who are you? She asked again, her voice cracking slightly despite her best efforts to sound confident. I'm just someone who knows when someone else is in over their head, the man replied cryptically, his voice as smooth as silk. And I'm here to make sure you don't make things worse for yourself. Every muscle in her body screamed to get away from him, but she didn't move. Instead, she locked eyes with him, trying to find any hint of vulnerability, any sign that she could negotiate her way out of this. I'm not going anywhere with you, Jessica said, her voice a little stronger now. So if you're looking for answers, you'd better start explaining yourself. The man's expression didn't change. He simply took another step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. He was too close now, and she could feel the weight of his presence like a physical force pressing down on her chest. You don't understand, he said softly, his words carrying an almost terrifying calm. This is bigger than you think, and you're already involved, whether you like it or not. Jessica could feel a flicker of fear creeping into her chest, but she fought it down. She had been through too much to be intimidated by this man, or anyone, but there was something about him that was different. Something in the way he spoke, the way he moved, that suggested he wasn't someone to be trifled with. Bigger than I think? She repeated, a sarcastic edge creeping into her voice. I'm just an accountant, buddy. I'm not part of whatever scheme you're talking about. He tilted his head, as if considering her words. That's where you're wrong, Jessica. You've always been part of it. You just didn't know it until now. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She felt her stomach twist with a combination of fear and disbelief. Was he implying that she had been part of something criminal without even realizing it? Was she somehow tied to the very thing she had uncovered? Before she could respond, the man took another step forward, his cold eyes narrowing. Let's not make this difficult, he said in a low voice. I don't want to hurt you. I just need you to come with me, and we can sort all of this out. You won't be in any danger. But if you keep resisting, he trailed off, letting the threat hang in the air like a heavy fog. Jessica's mind was racing. She had no idea who this man was or what he wanted, but one thing was clear. He was not going to let her go. Not without a fight. You don't get to tell me what to do, she said, her voice hardening. I'm not going anywhere with you. The man's lips curled into a smile, but it was devoid of humor. It was the smile of someone who had already won, someone who knew exactly how this would play out. Without warning, he reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip tight and unyielding. Jessica gasped, panic rising in her chest as she struggled to break free. But his hold was like iron, and no matter how hard she twisted, she couldn't escape. Let go of me, she shouted, but her voice seemed to vanish into the stillness of the hallway. For a brief moment, she thought about screaming, about drawing attention to herself. But that was a dangerous gamble. This man was no ordinary hotel employee or security guard. He was something else entirely. Her thoughts raced. There had to be something she could do. She had to get away. But as she struggled against his grip, her mind flashed to the documents in her bag, the papers that contained everything she had uncovered about the hotel's financial dealings. She couldn't let them fall into his hands. Not now. With a burst of adrenaline, Jessica drove her elbow into the man's side, trying to break his hold. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him stagger back slightly. Just enough for her to yank her arm free. Without wasting another second, she spun on her heels and bolted down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know where she was running to, but she couldn't afford to stop now. The man didn't chase her, but his voice followed her down the corridor, echoing in the space around her. "This isn't over, Jessica. You'll regret this." But Jessica didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. Jessica's breath came in ragged gasps as she rounded the corner, her footsteps pounding on the cold tile floor of the hotel. Her heart felt like it was about to burst from her chest, each beat echoing in her ears as her mind raced to process what had just happened. She hadn't seen the man's face clearly. Everything had happened too quickly, but his cold, almost mechanical demeanor haunted her. Who was he? And what did he want with her? She didn't know how much of a head start she had, but she couldn't afford to waste time wondering. Her only goal now was to get out. Get far away from this place and the mess she'd stumbled into. Jessica darted through the hotel's back hallways, taking turns at random, desperate for a way out. She passed empty rooms, maintenance closets, and a few startled staff members, none of whom seemed to notice or care that she was running for her life. The city's hum seemed distant, as if she was already lost in another world entirely. At the end of the hall, she found a fire exit. The door was locked, but she didn't hesitate. She smashed her shoulder into it, forcing it open with the sound of grinding metal. Outside, the night air hit her like a wall of cold. She barely registered it before she was sprinting toward the alleyway. She had no plan, no real idea of where to go. All she knew was that she couldn't stay here. Not with that man out there. As she ran through the alley, the noises of the city became a blur. She had a pounding headache from the adrenaline, her mind still tangled in the chaos of the last few minutes. She kept looking over her shoulder, expecting the man to appear at any second, but the street behind her remained empty. It wasn't until she reached a busy intersection that she slowed, chest heaving, trying to catch her breath. The city felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in. Even with the crowded streets and the neon lights, she felt alone. Her mind kept flashing back to the man, the way he had grabbed her, his voice calm, like he was already in control. But what did he know about her involvement? And what did he mean when he said she had always been part of it? Jessica pushed the thought away, shaking her head. She needed to focus. She needed answers, and she needed to get them fast. With shaky hands, she reached into her bag, pulling out the envelope. The documents were still there, untouched. Her stomach churned as she looked at the contents, the paperwork, the spreadsheets, the list of names that linked back to the laundering scheme. If she could get these to the right person, maybe she could finally bring this all to light. But who could she trust? She couldn't go to the police, not after what had just happened. Whoever the man was, he had power, and she knew he would be able to pull strings, make her disappear if he needed to. She had to find someone who could protect her, someone who was already in the know. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. Jessica fumbled to pull it out, still glancing nervously around. She didn't recognize the number. With hesitation, she answered. "Hello?" A deep voice on the other end made her freeze. "You don't know me, but I know you, Jessica." Her blood ran cold. It was the same voice, the man from the hallway. "Listen closely," he continued, his tone just as calm as before. "I'm giving you one chance. You can meet me, we can have a conversation, and you can walk away from this without getting yourself hurt. Or you can keep running, and I promise, it won't end well for you." Jessica's mind spun. What was he talking about? He was already threatening her again. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. "I don't want anything from you," he said, his voice cool and disinterested. "I want you to understand the situation. You've been digging into something much bigger than you think. You've already crossed a line, and now you need to decide how you want this to go." "I don't know what you're talking about," Jessica replied quickly, her pulse racing. She was done being afraid, done being pushed around. "I'm not meeting you. and I'm definitely not listening to any more of your threats." She started to hang up, but the man's voice stopped her. "Don't hang up, Jessica. Not yet. I know you think you're in control right now, but you're not. You're too far in, and no matter what you do, there's no getting out. The people you're dealing with, they don't leave loose ends." He paused, and Jessica could almost hear the smirk in his voice. "You've got one day to meet me. If you don't—" The line went dead. Jessica stood frozen, her heart pounding. She stared at the phone, a sick feeling churning in her stomach. This wasn't just some random threat. The man knew her, knew about the documents, knew about the danger she was in. She couldn't go to the authorities. She couldn't trust anyone at the hotel. The people behind this scheme were everywhere, and the man who had just called her was proof of it. Whoever they were willing to play dirty, and they were watching her every move. Her phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't the same number. This one was from an unknown contact. Taking a deep breath, she pressed accept and put the phone to her ear. "Jessica? It's Evelyn. I know everything." Jessica's fingers tightened around the phone as Evelyn's voice crackled through the speaker. The name sent a shiver down her spine. Evelyn had been part of the inner circle, one of the few people in the hotel who had any idea of the depths of the operation. The fact that she was calling now felt like both a lifeline and a warning. "How do you know about this?" Jessica asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. The night had taken so many unexpected turns, she was starting to wonder if she was even in control of her own story anymore. "I know everything because I've been watching you," Evelyn replied, her voice smooth and calm, but there was an underlying edge to it. "I saw what happened, Jessica. The documents, the way you've been poking around. It's dangerous, but it doesn't have to end badly. You just need to understand who you're dealing with." The streetlights cast an eerie glow on Jessica's face as she walked down the alley, her mind racing. "Who am I dealing with, Evelyn? What's really going on here?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Jessica could almost hear Evelyn deliberating, weighing her words carefully before speaking. "You think this is about money, don't you?" Evelyn said slowly, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "It's not. It's much bigger than that. The people you're tangled up with, they control more than just the hotel. They're part of a network that spans across the city, across the country. They move money, power, and influence around in ways that you can't even begin to imagine." Jessica stopped walking. She was starting to feel like she was drowning in her own confusion, the weight of the words sinking in. "But what does that have to do with me?" Evelyn's voice grew even quieter, more urgent. "Everything, Jessica. You were never supposed to find out, but you did. And now they'll stop at nothing to make sure you stay quiet. If you try to go to the police, you won't last 24 hours. But if you trust me, if you meet me and listen to what I have to say, you might have a chance." Jessica's head spun. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Everything about Evelyn's tone was too smooth, too rehearsed. Was she telling the truth? Or was she just another piece of the puzzle, another person to lead her deeper into danger? "I don't know what you're offering," Jessica said, her voice trembling despite herself. "I don't know if I can trust you." "You don't have a choice," Evelyn replied bluntly. "Look, they're coming for you, Jessica. The man you saw in the hallway? He works for them, and he's not the only one. There's a whole team of people who are watching your every move, and they won't stop until they get what they want. Why should I believe you?" Jessica's voice was barely above a whisper now. She could feel her pulse pounding in her throat. "Because I'm the one who's been keeping you safe this whole time," Evelyn said with a sudden fierceness. "I'm the one who tipped off the hotel security when they first tried to plant those documents in your room. I'm the one who's been clearing a path for you to get out without being noticed." Jessica felt a flicker of hope. Was it possible? Had Evelyn really been on her side all along? Or was this just another game? "Where do I meet you?" Jessica asked, her words slipping out before she could stop them. She was too far gone now, too deep in the mess to back out. Evelyn gave her the location, an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. "Come alone," she added. "And don't trust anyone else. Not even me if you have to." The line went dead before Jessica could respond. She stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in her hand. She wasn't sure if she had just made a huge mistake, or if this was her one shot to figure out the truth. The night air felt colder now, and Jessica wrapped her jacket tighter around herself. She couldn't wait any longer. The threat was real. She could feel it in her bones. And now, she had to move fast before everything collapsed on her. As she moved through the city streets, each step felt like it was bringing her closer to something she couldn't outrun. But she had no choice. She had to meet Evelyn. She had to know the truth. But what if Evelyn was lying? What if she was part of the conspiracy, manipulating Jessica into walking right into a trap? The questions gnawed at Jessica, but there was no time to figure it out. She couldn't afford to second-guess herself. She had to trust someone, anyone, if she was going to get out of this alive. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its silhouette dark and foreboding. Jessica's legs felt heavy as she approached, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but she pressed on. This was it, the point of no return. She stepped through the rusted metal door, her heart pounding in her chest, her fingers cold as they wrapped around the handle. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the empty space, the dim light from a single bulb flickering above her. Her breath caught in her throat as she peered into the shadows, trying to make out any figure. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence, and Jessica froze. "You made it," Evelyn said, stepping out from behind a stack of crates, her face partly obscured by shadows. "But you're too late." The words hung in the air like an omen, and Jessica felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "You're too late." Evelyn's voice, usually calm and reassuring, now had a dark edge to it. She stepped further into the dim light, her expression unreadable, almost like a stranger wearing a familiar face. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Her voice trembled despite her best efforts to sound confident. She'd come here expecting clarity, expecting to understand who had been pulling the strings all along. Instead, Evelyn's words had thrown everything into chaos. Evelyn smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You've been running around in circles, Jessica. You think you're trying to stop them, stop this whole thing from collapsing. But the truth is, the pieces have already been set in motion. The plan's already in motion. You're too far behind." Jessica's pulse quickened. "What plan? What's going on here, Evelyn?" She could feel her breath becoming shallow as a sense of dread crept in. She had trusted Evelyn, had let her believe that she could guide her out of this maze. But now, it felt like the ground beneath her was crumbling. "Let me show you." Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope. It was thin, almost too thin to hold anything important. But the moment she handed it to Jessica, her heart sank. She could see the faint bulge inside, the weight of the documents that had started all of this. Jessica hesitated, unsure whether she should open it. The way Evelyn had been speaking, like she was no longer on Jessica's side, made her hesitant to trust anything coming from her. But she was here now, and she had to know. She tore open the envelope. Inside were photographs, grainy, indistinct images of people she didn't recognize, but the context made her stomach churn. In one picture, a man with a heavy build stood in front of a bank, holding what appeared to be a briefcase. In another, a luxury car parked outside a nondescript building, its sleek design unmistakable, but the angle too oblique to make out the model. "Who are these people?" Jessica asked, her fingers shaking as she flipped through the images. Evelyn stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "You've seen them before, Jessica. You just didn't realize it." She reached over and pointed to one of the photographs, a man in a black suit, his back turned toward the camera. "This one. He's the one who hired you. The man you've been taking orders from." Jessica's stomach lurched. It was too much. She couldn't process it all. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying that everything you thought you knew about the hotel, about your job, it's all a lie. The man who owns it is not who you think he is. The operation goes far deeper than just a few shady deals. He's involved in money laundering, arms trafficking, and worse. And he's been using you to keep everything in check." Jessica felt as though the walls were closing in on her. The hotel had always seemed a little too pristine, too perfect. But she'd never once suspected that there was something darker lurking beneath the surface. How could she have missed it? "No!" Jessica shook her head, trying to block out the sudden storm of images in her mind. You're lying. This is all. I'm not lying, Evelyn interrupted, her voice sharp. I've been trying to warn you. The man you're working for, he's not just running a hotel. He's running an empire. And you've been caught in the middle of it. But it's too late for you to back out. They know everything about you, Jessica. They've been watching your every move. Jessica staggered backward, her legs suddenly weak beneath her. The air in the warehouse seemed to grow colder, suffocating. I didn't know, she gasped. I didn't know any of this. Evelyn sighed, as if the weight of the truth was something she had been carrying for far too long. I know, but now you do. And that's the problem. Once you know, there's no going back. They'll come for you, just like they've come for everyone else who's figured it out. The question now is, what are you going to do with this information? Jessica swallowed hard. Her mind raced, her thoughts jumbled. The truth was out, but it felt like it was too late for her to do anything about it. She had been running, trying to escape the invisible forces closing in on her, and now she felt like she was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. You can't just give me this and walk away, Jessica said, her voice cracking. You can't just leave me with this information and expect me to figure it out. Evelyn's expression hardened. I'm not walking away, Jessica. I'm giving you a choice, a chance to do something about it. I've been setting things up for you. But if you want to take the next step, you'll have to trust me completely. Because once you get involved, once you know too much, you'll be in this for good. Trust you? Jessica repeated, her voice incredulous. How do I know you're not working for them? How do I know you're not just setting me up? Evelyn's face softened for a moment, but only briefly. I get it. I understand why you're hesitant. But think about it, Jessica. I've been trying to help you. I could have stayed in the shadows, but I didn't. I'm giving you the chance to take back control. Jessica looked down at the photographs again, her hands shaking as she turned the pages. There was no denying it. The people in the pictures, the man who ran the hotel, it all made sense now, but it also felt like a punch to her gut. She had been a pawn in someone else's game, a game much bigger than anything she had ever imagined. I need time to think, Jessica said finally, her voice trembling. She needed to process everything, to figure out what the next step would be. Evelyn nodded, but her eyes remained cold, calculating. You don't have much time, Jessica. They're already on their way here. Suddenly, the sound of distant engines rumbled through the walls of the warehouse. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. They're coming, Evelyn whispered. And this time, they won't let you walk away. Jessica's mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts as the rumble of distant engines grew louder. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to run, to find some way to escape the nightmare she had stumbled into. But Evelyn's warning echoed in her ears, a relentless reminder that the people chasing her were already too close. They're coming for you, Jessica. Evelyn's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, and it sent a chill down her spine. They'll stop at nothing. The weight of the situation settled heavily in Jessica's chest. She glanced around the dim warehouse, searching for any means of escape, but everything felt like a dead end. No windows, no doors that weren't locked, just the distant roar of engines and the creeping fear that it was already too late. You said you've been setting things up for me, Jessica said, her voice shaky but determined. What does that mean? How can I get out of this? Evelyn stepped closer, her face now completely unreadable. I've put together a plan, a way for you to get out without getting caught. But it's not going to be easy, and you're going to have to trust me more than you ever have before. Jessica swallowed, the weight of the decision pressing on her. Trust Evelyn? The woman who had been so cryptic, who had only given her fragments of the truth when she needed all the answers. But the alternative was worse, being caught, dragged deeper into the web that had already ensnared her. I don't have a choice, do I? Jessica muttered, more to herself than to Evelyn. I have to go along with whatever you're suggesting. No, Evelyn said firmly. You do have a choice. You can choose to run, to try and escape this world entirely. But that comes with its own set of risks. Or, you can stay, dig deeper, and take the fight to them. Jessica's head swam with the weight of it all. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the anxiety and adrenaline fueling her every thought. Time was running out. The engines were closer now, the sound of tires skidding against the gravel unmistakable. Evelyn moved quickly, stepping over to a table cluttered with papers. I've been working with people who want to bring this operation down. They've got the resources, the influence, but they need someone on the inside, someone who can get them what they need. Jessica looked at her, confusion clouding her mind. What are you saying? You want me to be your spy? No, Evelyn's expression softened, though there was still something calculating in her eyes. I want you to be more than that. I want you to help take them down. From the inside. The man who runs that hotel, he's not just dangerous. He's part of a larger syndicate, and they've got their hands in everything. Money laundering, trafficking, even political corruption. If you want to make sure this stops, if you want to make sure you're not just a pawn in their game, then you need to take control. Jessica's head spun. She had never asked for this. She had never wanted to be caught up in something this big, this deadly. But the truth was, she didn't have a choice anymore. The man who had hired her, the system she'd been unknowingly complicit in, everything was bigger than her now. And the only way out was through. How do I even begin to stop them? Jessica asked, her voice barely a whisper. Evelyn's eyes gleamed with a flicker of something unreadable. You start by getting close to the man in charge, the one who's been pulling all the strings. You need to gain his trust, become indispensable to him. And when the time's right, you take him down. Jessica felt a rush of panic surge through her. She didn't know how to play this game. She wasn't a spy. She didn't know how to infiltrate the world of crime, of deceit, and dangerous men. But one thing was clear. If she didn't act fast, she would be just another victim of the syndicate. Before she could respond, the sound of tires skidding to a stop echoed through the warehouse. Jessica's heart leapt into her throat. She wasn't sure how much time she had, but it wasn't long. Evelyn's face hardened. They're here, she said, her voice low and urgent. We need to move now. Move where? Jessica's voice cracked, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the situation. Evelyn grabbed her by the arm, pulling her toward a narrow door at the far end of the warehouse. I have a safe house. It's not far, but you need to trust me, Jessica. This is your chance. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest as she allowed Evelyn to drag her along. The sound of footsteps echoed in the warehouse behind them, each step growing louder, closer. You can't go back to your apartment, Evelyn said, her voice urgent. You'll be a sitting duck. They'll find you there. They'll find you anywhere you go unless you follow my plan. Jessica's breath came in short, shallow bursts as they reached the door. The reality of her situation was starting to hit her. She was on the run now. A part of her had always known that the life she had built was a fragile illusion. But this was something she couldn't ignore any longer. Evelyn opened the door and pushed Jessica through it, her grip tight, her urgency clear. The cold air of the night hit Jessica like a slap in the face, but there was no time to adjust. They ran down a narrow alley, their footsteps echoing off the walls, until they reached a black sedan parked at the end of the street. Get in, Evelyn commanded, and Jessica didn't hesitate. She couldn't. Not anymore. As they sped away from the warehouse, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but the weight of what was coming, the unknown dangers, the ticking clock, pressed heavier on Jessica's chest. There was no going back now. Her life was no longer her own. The hum of the engine was the only sound that filled the car as Jessica sat in the passenger seat, her hands trembling in her lap. Her breath came in shallow, quick bursts, the reality of the past hours finally catching up with her. Her world had shifted overnight, and now everything felt like it was happening too fast, too violently, like she was on the edge of a cliff, and there was no way to stop her descent. She turned to Evelyn, who was driving with focused precision, her hands gripping the wheel as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Her face was calm, almost eerily so, but Jessica saw the glint of something in her eyes, something cold and calculating. The moment Jessica had crossed into this world, Evelyn had become her only ally, but how much could she really trust her? So, where are we going? Jessica finally asked, her voice breaking the silence. What's this safe house you keep mentioning? Evelyn's eyes flicked briefly to her, then back to the road. It's not far. It's a place I set up for situations like this. No one knows about it except me and a few trusted people. You'll be safe there, at least for a while. Jessica tried to relax her grip on her seat, but it was no use. Every turn, every street they passed seemed unfamiliar, as though the city had morphed into a maze of shadows. The people who were chasing her, they knew these streets. They knew how to find her. She was running blind. I don't know if I can keep doing this, Jessica admitted quietly, staring out the window as the night blurred by. I don't know if I'm cut out for this. I'm not a spy, Evelyn. I'm just a waitress. I never signed up for this. Evelyn glanced over at her again, this time her face softening ever so slightly. I get it, Jessica. I know this wasn't the life you expected, but you're in it now, and there's no turning back. The people who are after you, they don't care about you. They don't care about anyone. They won't stop until they've destroyed everything in their path. Jessica's heart sank. It felt like a heavy weight in her chest, threatening to crush her. She had never asked for this, never wanted to be part of something so big, so dangerous. But here she was, caught in a game she didn't understand, forced to play by rules she didn't even know existed. So what now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What am I supposed to do? Evelyn's gaze hardened again, her focus sharp as they sped through the dark streets. We wait. We regroup. We get you settled in the safe house, and we figure out what your next move is. But the longer you stay exposed, the more dangerous it gets. You need to be smart. Every move has to count. Jessica nodded slowly, though doubt still clung to her like a second skin. She didn't know what she was doing. She didn't know how to outsmart the people chasing her, or how to bring down the man at the top of it all. But one thing was clear. Her options were running out fast. As they drove deeper into the heart of the city, the streets grew quieter, more isolated. The city that had once felt so familiar now felt like a strange, foreign place. It was as though everything she had known had been wiped away in an instant, and she was left in an alien world, surrounded by people she couldn't trust. After what felt like an eternity, Evelyn finally pulled into a narrow alleyway. She stopped the car behind a high, brick wall, and for a moment, the two of them sat in silence. This is it, Evelyn said, cutting the engine. She opened the door and stepped out without another word, leaving Jessica to follow suit. Jessica stepped onto the cold, uneven pavement, her breath fogging in the chill of the night air. She looked around. The alley was dark, quiet, too quiet. It felt like the world had just paused, waiting for something to happen. Evelyn led her to a door at the end of the alley, hidden from sight by the shadows. She knocked twice, the sound sharp and quick. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a man standing inside, his face shadowed by the dim light. Evelyn, he said in a low voice, his eyes flicking to Jessica. Is she the one? Evelyn nodded, her expression unreadable. This is Jessica. She's the one we talked about. The man didn't say anything else. He stepped aside, allowing them both to enter. The door slammed shut behind them, sealing them off from the world outside. Inside, the safe house was sparse but functional. A small living area with basic furniture, nothing fancy, nothing that would stand out. The walls were lined with shelves of supplies, and a large map of the city was pinned to the wall, dotted with red pins marking various locations. Evelyn motioned for Jessica to sit. This is your new home for the time being. We'll keep you hidden here until we can figure out what your next move is. Jessica nodded, though she felt anything but reassured. She had expected a place to hide, something discreet, but not this. It felt too temporary, like she was living on borrowed time. This is not going to be easy, the man said, breaking the silence. You're in too deep now. The people we're up against, there's no negotiating with them. No mercy. Jessica looked at him, her heart hammering in her chest. What do I need to do? Evelyn's voice was sharp, focused. You need to stay out of sight. Don't make any moves unless you absolutely have to. The moment you slip up, they'll find you. And when they do, we won't be able to help you. The weight of her words sank in. Jessica felt the walls closing in around her. She had no choice now but to follow their plan. There was no escaping the mess she had found herself in. As Evelyn and the man began discussing the next steps, Jessica sank into the worn armchair, her mind racing. Every instinct told her to run, to get as far away as possible, but Evelyn had made it clear that wasn't an option. The question lingered in her mind as she stared at the map on the wall. How much longer could she survive in this world? Jessica woke to the sound of a phone ringing, its shrill tones slicing through the heavy silence of the safe house. She blinked into the dim light of early morning, her body still stiff from the uncomfortable armchair she'd slept in. Her mind, foggy from the lack of rest, struggled to process the reality of the situation. The ring of the phone seemed to echo off the walls of the small room, reminding her that nothing about this new life would be ordinary. Not anymore. She rubbed her eyes and glanced at the clock on the wall. It was barely dawn, the sky still dark and uninviting outside the tiny window. The cold air of the room was a stark contrast to the heat of the panic she felt. The phone stopped ringing, only to start up again. This time, Evelyn's voice cut through the quiet as she entered the room, her expression tense but controlled. "Don't answer it," Evelyn said, her tone low. "Not unless it's absolutely necessary." Jessica hesitated. "But what if it's them? What if it's someone I can trust?" Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her gaze never leaving the phone. "If it's someone you trust, they'll leave a message. You don't want to risk alerting anyone who's watching." Jessica swallowed hard, her mouth dry. She wasn't used to living like this, on edge, paranoid, always second-guessing every decision. She didn't know if she had the strength to keep doing it, but there was no other choice. Her life had already been turned upside down, and there was no undoing it now. She sat still, her heart pounding in her chest, as the phone rang a third time, then a fourth. Each ring was a reminder that her past life was gone. It wasn't just about hiding anymore, it was about survival. Every moment that passed felt like she was inching closer to a cliff, with nothing to break her fall. Evelyn finally stepped forward, her hand reaching for the phone, but then she stopped. She seemed to hesitate, as though weighing a decision. Then, without another word, she lifted the receiver. "Hello?" Evelyn's voice was calm, measured. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Jessica couldn't hear what was being said, but Evelyn's face shifted imperceptibly, her jaw tightening. Whoever it was, they were saying something important. Evelyn's gaze flicked to Jessica, signaling her to stay quiet. "I understand," Evelyn said in a clipped tone. "I'll handle it." She hung up the phone with an almost inaudible click, her fingers lingering on the receiver. Her expression was unreadable, but Jessica could sense the tension in the air. "Who was it?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her back to Jessica, her gaze drifting to the map on the wall, her mind clearly elsewhere. Jessica noticed the way her shoulders were set, rigid, like she was preparing for something. She was waiting for a storm to hit. "Who was it?" Jessica pressed, her voice shaking now, a mix of fear and curiosity clawing at her insides. Evelyn took a deep breath before finally turning to face her. Her eyes were cold, the wall she had carefully built around herself now evident in the way she carried herself. "It was someone who knows what we're up against," Evelyn said quietly. "Someone who thinks it's time to move forward with the plan." "The plan?" Jessica echoed, her heart rate picking up again. "What plan?" Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "The one where we take them down." Jessica blinked, confusion clouding her thoughts. "Take who down?" Evelyn exhaled slowly, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "The people who've been tracking you. The ones who want you out of the picture for good." Jessica's stomach twisted at the mention of them. The people she had never fully understood. The ones who had put her life in danger. All she knew was that they were ruthless. And if Evelyn was willing to confront them, it meant the stakes were higher than she had realized. "I don't even know who these people are," Jessica said, her voice barely audible, the weight of her situation crashing down on her once again. "I don't know what I'm up against." Evelyn's gaze softened for a moment, a flicker of sympathy passing through her eyes before she quickly masked it with resolve. "You don't need to know everything right now. Just trust me when I say that we're not going to let them win. Not if I have anything to do with it." Jessica stared at her, trying to read her, but the more she looked, the more it felt like she was staring into the eyes of a stranger. Evelyn had her own demons, her own motivations. Jessica couldn't see them clearly, not yet. But she knew one thing: Evelyn was dangerous. And the more she stayed close to her, the more she felt herself being pulled into a world that was darker and more twisted than she could have ever imagined. "Do you have a plan?" Jessica asked, her voice cracking. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned away again, her mind clearly churning with thoughts of what came next. "There's a meeting tonight," she said after a moment, her voice distant. "We'll be there. We'll get the information we need." Jessica's stomach churned at the idea of stepping back into the danger zone, but she had no choice. She had to follow Evelyn's lead, even if it felt like walking into the lion's den. "What kind of meeting?" Jessica asked, her voice tight. "A high-level one," Evelyn replied, her tone even. "Where decisions are made. Where we'll get a chance to learn who's behind all this. It's the only way to figure out what we're up against and how to take them down for good." Jessica didn't respond right away, her thoughts swirling in a mix of fear and determination. She didn't know if she was ready for this, but there was no turning back now. She had made her choice when she decided to trust Evelyn. The phone call had been a warning. The game was changing, and Jessica had to be ready for whatever came next. The night felt colder than usual as Jessica stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. It had been a long day, filled with nervous energy and the heavy weight of anticipation. Evelyn had gone to great lengths to prepare her, but Jessica still felt a lingering sense of unease. The plan, whatever it was, didn't feel real until now. She glanced over her shoulder to where Evelyn was pacing the small room, checking and rechecking the small details. She had dressed for the occasion: black jacket, dark jeans, boots, and her face was set in an expression of pure focus. Evelyn had always been the one in control, the one who knew what to do next. But tonight, even she seemed on edge. "We're going to have to move quickly," Evelyn said, her voice sharp, like she was talking to herself as much as to Jessica. "Once we're inside, we can't afford to make any mistakes. No hesitation. Understand?" Jessica nodded. She understood. There was no room for mistakes, no chance for error. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different, darker. The people they were up against weren't just dangerous. They were organized, and they had resources. Evelyn had been confident when she spoke about the plan, but Jessica had seen enough in her time with her to know that not all plans went smoothly. "Do you trust me?" Evelyn asked, suddenly stopping in front of Jessica. Her eyes bored into her, searching for something in Jessica's expression, as if she needed reassurance too. Jessica hesitated. Her instinct told her that she should trust Evelyn. Evelyn had saved her life more than once. But trust wasn't something that could be easily given. It had to be earned, and Jessica wasn't sure if she had the luxury of waiting for that to happen. "I do," Jessica said finally, the words feeling heavier than they should have. She wasn't sure if she meant it, or if she was simply telling Evelyn what she wanted to hear. Evelyn studied her for a moment longer before nodding. "Good. Stick to me tonight, and we'll get through this. Just follow my lead." Jessica tried to steady her nerves as they made their way out of the safe house. The night air was crisp, biting at her skin as they climbed into the black SUV that would take them to the meeting. She had never felt so exposed before. The city streets seemed eerily quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound filling the tense silence between them. The vehicle passed through the city streets, its headlights cutting through the dark. Jessica tried to calm her racing heart, reminding herself that she was doing this for a reason. The meeting would provide answers, or at least a step closer to the truth. It would give her a chance to understand who was pulling the strings and why they had targeted her. Evelyn didn't say much during the drive. She was focused, her eyes scanning every street, every person they passed. Jessica couldn't help but wonder what she saw in those moments. The way her gaze flicked from one place to the next, as though she was constantly measuring risk, calculating outcomes. It was a skill that Jessica didn't yet possess, but she knew she needed it if she was going to survive this. Finally, the SUV pulled up to an inconspicuous building on the outskirts of the city, tucked away behind high walls and a set of security gates. It looked like any other office complex, but Jessica knew better. This was no ordinary meeting. There was a heaviness in the air, like a storm was about to break. Evelyn motioned for Jessica to follow her. The two of them approached the building cautiously, moving through the shadows with practiced ease. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest as they reached the entrance, a steel door guarded by two men who barely acknowledged them as they passed. Evelyn had handled this part, Jessica realized, as she felt the weight of the security watching them from every corner. She couldn't let herself be intimidated now. Inside, the building was cold and sterile, its white walls reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights above. The hallway stretched out before them, empty and silent except for the soft echo of their footsteps. Evelyn's pace didn't slow. She moved with a sense of purpose, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. At the end of the hall, they stopped before a large, unmarked door. Evelyn glanced at Jessica once more, her eyes searching. "Stay close," she whispered. "And remember, don't say anything unless I tell you to." Jessica nodded, her stomach tight with nerves. She had no idea what to expect on the other side of that door, but she was about to find out. Evelyn knocked once, sharply, before turning the handle and pushing the door open. The room beyond was dimly lit, the low hum of voices filling the space. A long conference table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by men and women in dark suits. Their faces were serious, their eyes sharp as they turned toward Evelyn and Jessica. "Good evening," Evelyn said coolly, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made the room fall into a tense silence. "I trust everything is in order?" A man seated at the head of the table leaned forward, his face expressionless. "We'll see soon enough," he replied, his voice low but commanding. "Have a seat." Jessica followed Evelyn as they took their places at the table, her every instinct screaming at her to be cautious. She studied the people around her, trying to pick out any clues that might give her an edge, but they were all professionals, too well trained to reveal anything in their body language. Evelyn didn't waste time. She went straight into the conversation, her words clipped and precise. "We know you have information. We need to know who is behind the operations targeting Jessica." The man at the head of the table didn't flinch. "We'll tell you what we know when we're ready," he said cryptically. "In the meantime, you'll do your part. You'll deliver the goods." Jessica felt the tension rising. It was clear that something was off, but she couldn't figure out exactly what. The conversation was being steered in a direction she wasn't prepared for, and she couldn't tell if Evelyn was in control anymore. "You'll get what you want," Evelyn replied, her voice sharp with resolve. "But first, we need answers." Jessica held her breath, waiting for the next move, the next twist in the conversation. She didn't know who to trust, or even if she could trust Evelyn. But one thing was certain, this meeting was only the beginning. And no matter what happened next, Jessica knew she was about to be pulled deeper into a world where nothing was as it seemed. The minutes dragged on, stretching uncomfortably as Jessica sat at the conference table, her mind racing. Evelyn had already begun to negotiate, her voice calm and calculated. But Jessica couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The people around the table were too still, their faces too unreadable. It was like they were waiting for something, waiting for her to make a mistake. Jessica's palms were sweating as she clenched her hands in her lap, trying to calm her nerves. Every instinct she had was screaming at her that something was wrong. This wasn't a typical business negotiation. The stakes were far higher than Evelyn had let on. A cold draft swept through the room as the door to the hallway creaked open, drawing Jessica's attention. A man in a dark suit stepped inside, his presence commanding. He was tall, with short cropped hair and a sharp, angular face that seemed to cut through the air. His eyes scanned the room quickly before settling on Jessica and Evelyn. "Sorry I'm late," the man said, his voice smooth and authoritative. "I trust one haven't missed anything important." Evelyn didn't look surprised to see him, but Jessica could sense the subtle tension in her body. The man must have been someone significant, someone important. "This is Mr. Harper," Evelyn said, nodding toward the newcomer. "He's the one I told you about." Mr. Harper walked to the head of the table and took a seat without asking. His eyes never left Jessica's face as he settled in. "I've heard a lot about you," he said, his tone almost too casual, as if they were having a friendly conversation. Jessica raised an eyebrow. "I'm sure you have." Harper didn't smile. "You're involved in something far bigger than you realize. We need to know where your loyalties lie." The words hit Jessica like a cold slap. She hadn't expected the conversation to take such a direct turn. She glanced at Evelyn, who seemed unfazed, but Jessica noticed the slight twitch at the corner of her mouth, an imperceptible sign that things were shifting in a direction she hadn't anticipated. "I'm not sure what you mean," Jessica replied, trying to maintain control of the situation. Her heart was racing, but she refused to let it show. Harper leaned forward, his gaze intense. "You think you're in the clear, don't you? You think you can walk away from this unscathed. But that's not how this works." He paused for a moment, allowing his words to hang in the air. "You're a pawn, Jessica. A tool we've been using for a long time." The shock hit Jessica like a blow to the chest. For a split second, she couldn't breathe. She thought she was in control of this situation, that Evelyn had a plan. But now, it was clear that she was the one being played. "Excuse me?" Jessica managed to say, her voice thick with disbelief. Harper's smile was cold, almost predatory. "You've been part of something much bigger than you thought. You didn't even realize it, did you? You're just a small piece in a much larger game." Evelyn's face remained unreadable, but Jessica saw the briefest flicker of something in her eyes, something like regret or maybe guilt. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to send a wave of suspicion crashing through Jessica. "No, this isn't right," Jessica said, standing up abruptly. "You're lying. All of this isn't what I signed up for." Harper remained calm, his hands steepled in front of him. "You didn't sign up for anything. You were chosen. And now, you're too deep in to get out." Jessica's mind was racing. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she didn't trust her own voice anymore. It felt like the ground was slipping out from under her. "I told you to trust me," Evelyn said quietly, her voice like ice. Jessica turned toward her, her eyes wide with a mix of anger and confusion. "You knew about this. You knew all along, didn't you?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately, but her silence spoke volumes. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time since meeting Evelyn, she felt truly betrayed. She had trusted her with her life, and now, it felt like that trust had been a lie. "Evelyn, what the hell is going on?" Jessica demanded, her voice shaky but sharp. "Why didn't you tell me?" Evelyn's eyes flicked to Harper before returning to Jessica. Her expression was cold, distant. "You wouldn't have believed me if I had." Jessica felt a cold chill wash over her. "So, you've been playing me this whole time? Everything we've been through, it was all part of your plan?" "Everything has its purpose," Evelyn said, her voice flat. "Your role in this was always predetermined." The words stung more than Jessica expected. She had always known there were secrets, always known there were things Evelyn wasn't telling her. But to hear it all laid out like this, so bluntly, left her feeling hollow. Harper seemed to sense the shift in the room. "This isn't personal," he said, his tone turning colder. "It's business, and it's not over yet." Jessica felt her blood run cold. She was trapped in a game she didn't understand, and the rules kept changing. The one person she thought she could rely on had just revealed herself to be part of the very system that was trying to control her. She had no allies, no escape. But then, a thought cut through the haze of confusion. She couldn't let this be the end. She couldn't let Evelyn or Harper win. She wasn't just a pawn in their game. She was still in control of her own fate. "I'm not going down without a fight," Jessica said, her voice low but full of resolve. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "You're already in too deep. There's no way out." Jessica met her gaze, unflinching. "We'll see about that." Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that she was suffocating. The walls of the conference room, once a symbol of power and opportunity, now felt like they were closing in around her. Evelyn's cold silence and Harper's smug expression were all the confirmation she needed. She had been played, and in a way, she had played herself. But despite the betrayal, Jessica wasn't ready to roll over. She wasn't ready to let these people control her. She had survived worse, much worse, and she could survive this too. The difference now was that she had nothing left to lose. Harper's eyes lingered on her, but Jessica refused to look away. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her. Not again. Evelyn, however, wasn't as easy to dismiss. Her former mentor, the woman who had promised to guide her, now stood on the opposite side of the battlefield. Her role in Jessica's downfall was clear, but there was still that flicker of something in her eyes, the one that suggested she hadn't completely given up on her. "Jessica," Evelyn said quietly, almost reluctantly, "you don't understand what you're dealing with." "I think I have a pretty good idea," Jessica shot back. "You and Harper, you've been manipulating me from the start." Harper smirked, unfazed. "We didn't manipulate you, Jessica. We gave you the opportunity to be part of something much bigger than yourself. You should be thanking us." Jessica felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. "Thank you? For what? For lying to me? For using me?" Evelyn took a step forward, her eyes narrowing. "This wasn't just about you, Jessica. This was bigger than any one person. Bigger than your little fantasy of making a difference. You're in this, whether you like it or not." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. "What's that supposed to mean?" Harper leaned forward, his eyes cold and calculating. "It means you don't get to walk away. There's no escaping what's already in motion." Jessica's mind raced. She couldn't afford to be a pawn any longer. She needed a way out, a way to regain control. And she wasn't about to wait for Harper or Evelyn to give it to her. She had to act, and she had to act fast. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning for any signs of weakness, any way to turn the tide in her favor. But the more she thought, the clearer it became. The only way out was to escape. "You're right about one thing," Jessica said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "I can't walk away. But that doesn't mean I'm going to sit here and wait for you to finish what you started." Harper's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "You're smarter than I thought, but it won't matter in the end." Jessica stood up from the table, her back straight. "I'm not waiting for the end. I'm making my own future from here on out." With that, she turned and walked toward the door. She knew she was taking a risk. She had no plan, no backup, but she couldn't let them control her anymore. She had to find her own way, even if it meant running into the unknown. As she reached for the door handle, Harper's voice rang out, low and menacing. "You think you can just walk away from all this? You think you have a choice?" Jessica hesitated, her hands still on the door. Her pulse quickened, but she knew this was the moment. She could either face whatever lay ahead or be consumed by this web of lies and manipulation. The decision was hers, and hers alone. Without looking back, she swung the door open and stepped out into the hallway. The cold air hit her like a slap in the face, but it was the first breath of freedom she'd had in days. She didn't know where she was going, but that didn't matter. The only thing that mattered now was getting away from them and figuring out how to take control of her life again. Her mind was a blur of thoughts, but one thing was clear. She needed to find out who was behind this operation and why. Harper and Evelyn were just the tip of the iceberg. There was someone pulling the strings, someone bigger and more dangerous than they could ever be. If she wanted to survive, she needed to find them and stop them. Jessica turned the corner, her shoes clicking against the tile floor. She could hear footsteps behind her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to stop. Every second she wasted was another second they could use to trap her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She fished it out quickly and glanced at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. "We know what you're planning. Don't try to run. You won't get far." Jessica's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't slow her pace. They were watching her. It didn't matter. She had come too far to let fear stop her now. As she rounded the next corner, she spotted a staircase leading down to the building's lower level. Without thinking, she bolted toward it, her feet pounding against the stairs as she descended into the shadows. The silence around her was deafening, but she couldn't afford to listen to it. She needed to find a way out of this building, out of their reach. She needed to disappear. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she paused for a moment, catching her breath. The darkness was all-consuming, but that's what she needed right now. She needed to be invisible. She needed to be elusive. She heard footsteps behind her again, and her pulse spiked. They were coming for her. It was only a matter of time before they found her. But Jessica wasn't going to be the one caught. Not this time. She darted into a side hallway, pushing past crates and boxes, her breath coming in short gasps. She was close. She could feel it. One more turn, and she would be out. But just as she rounded the final corner, she slammed straight into someone. She looked up, her heart hammering in her chest. It was Evelyn. Did you really think you could get away? Evelyn's voice was cold, but there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes, something that resembled pity. Jessica didn't have time for pity. Jessica's pulse raced as she stared into Evelyn's eyes. The hallway was narrow, the dim light flickering above them casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. She had almost made it. She was so close to freedom, but now, here was Evelyn, blocking her path like a shadow from the past. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Evelyn's eyes were calculating, as if she were sizing up her former protégé. Jessica stood frozen, a mixture of anger, fear, and defiance building up inside her. She had come too far to back down now. What's it going to be, Jessica? Evelyn's voice was low and almost sympathetic. Are you going to keep running? Or are you finally going to accept the reality of what you've gotten yourself into? Jessica shook her head, clenching her fists at her sides. You're not going to intimidate me, Evelyn. You've already done enough damage. Evelyn took a slow step forward, her heels clicking softly against the cold floor. You always did have that fire in you. I'll give you that. But fire can be controlled, Jessica. It can be snuffed out. And that's what I'm going to do. Jessica didn't flinch. She didn't step back. You're not in control anymore. You think I don't see through you? You've been playing me, Harper, everyone, like puppets. But you forgot one thing. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. And what's that? You underestimated me, Jessica replied firmly. You thought I'd stay in line, keep playing your game. But you pushed me too far. Now I'm done. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty passed over Evelyn's face, though it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She folded her arms across her chest and regarded Jessica with something approaching amusement. You really think you can walk away from this? From all of it? It's too late, Jessica. You're already in too deep. Jessica's heart was hammering in her chest, but she wasn't going to let her fear show. She had come this far, and no matter what Evelyn said, she wasn't going to be anyone's pawn anymore. If it's too late, then why are you still trying to control me? Jessica challenged. Why haven't you already finished what you started? Evelyn's gaze hardened. Because you're not just some pawn, Jessica. You were supposed to be part of something bigger. You were supposed to help us build something that would change everything. But you've been too naive to see it. Maybe I'm not the naive one, Jessica shot back. Maybe you've spent so long in your little bubble of power that you forgot what it's like to be a real person, to fight for something that matters. There was a long pause. Evelyn's eyes narrowed as she took another step forward. You really think you're going to stop this? You think you can just undo everything we've built? You're nothing but a pawn in this game. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. There it was again, the word pawn. She hated it. She hated the way Evelyn said it, like she was insignificant, but it only made her resolve stronger. She took a step toward Evelyn, her voice low but steady. I may have been a pawn, but I'm done playing. You don't get to decide who I am anymore. You don't get to control my future. Evelyn's lips curled into a bitter smile. You think this is a game, Jessica? You think you can just walk away from all of this? You've seen too much. You know too much. And now you're a liability. Jessica took a deep breath. She was scared, but she wouldn't let that fear control her. You've already lost, Evelyn. You just don't realize it yet. With that, she turned and sprinted down the hallway. Her feet pounded against the floor as she heard Evelyn's footsteps close behind. She couldn't afford to stop. She couldn't afford to be caught. The sound of heels clicking rapidly behind her only spurred her on. She glanced over her shoulder to see Evelyn closing in, but Jessica was faster. She knew this building. She knew its twists and turns. She had to outsmart her former mentor, outrun her, outlast her. As she reached the end of the hall, Jessica pushed through a door, finding herself in an alleyway behind the building. She breathed in the cool night air, her body shaking with adrenaline. The alley was narrow, dark, and empty, but it was her only escape route. She didn't slow down, even as she heard the door to the building slam open behind her. She had seconds, maybe less. She had to disappear before Evelyn got to her. But just as she rounded the corner, A pair of strong hands grabbed her from behind. "Gotcha," came a low voice, and Jessica's blood ran cold. She whipped around, her body tensing, but the man's grip was like iron. She knew the voice. It was Harper. "Did you really think you could get away?" Harper said, his voice filled with cold amusement. "You're not as clever as you think." Jessica's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She was trapped. But then, something snapped in her mind. The panic, the fear, the helplessness. It all burned away, replaced with pure, unrelenting determination. She wasn't going to let this happen. Not again. With one swift movement, she brought her elbow back, driving it into Harper's ribs. He staggered back, gasping for air. But it was enough. Jessica broke free of his grip and ran down the alley, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She heard him shout after her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Every step was a battle, every breath a struggle, but she wasn't going to let them win. She wasn't going to let them control her. Jessica's legs burned, but she kept running. She had no idea where she was going, but it didn't matter. As long as she was moving, as long as she was free, she had a chance. And she wasn't about to let that chance slip away. The sound of footsteps echoed behind Jessica, each step growing louder, faster. She couldn't afford to look back. She had to keep moving. She had to outrun them, or everything she had fought for would be lost. She darted down another narrow street, weaving through the shadows. Her lungs burned. Her legs felt like lead, but there was no time to stop. Every breath she took was ragged, every beat of her heart a reminder of the danger that was closing in. She couldn't let them win. She couldn't let Harper and Evelyn have control over her life again. Not after everything she'd been through. Not after all the lies they'd fed her. But no matter how fast she ran, she could feel them gaining on her. There was a sickening certainty in the air, an overwhelming sense that no matter how hard she tried, she was always going to be one step behind. She could hear Harper's voice, low and filled with menace, calling her name from behind. "Jessica, don't make this harder than it has to be. We can still make a deal. You don't have to run." But she didn't stop. She couldn't. The thought of making a deal with them was unthinkable. She had already given up too much. The only way out now was to keep going, to find a way to break free for good. Her pulse raced as she turned another corner, praying for a way out. Her mind raced, searching for an escape route, but the streets were empty, eerily silent. The city felt like a maze, and she was trapped in it, running in circles with no end in sight. She rounded yet another corner, only to come face to face with a dead end. A brick wall loomed before her, tall and unforgiving. Her breath caught in her throat. She had nowhere to go. She turned around just as Harper emerged from the shadows, his face cold, his eyes dark with resolve. He was too close now, too close for her to outrun him. "End of the line, Jessica," he said, his voice filled with an unsettling calm. "You can't run forever." Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, all the fight seemed to drain out of her. But then, something inside her snapped. She wasn't done yet. She wasn't going down without a fight. Her hands shook, but she kept her wits about her. She scanned her surroundings, looking for anything that could give her a chance. Her eyes landed on a rusty fire escape ladder on the side of the building to her right. Without thinking, she bolted toward it, her legs carrying her in a blur of motion. Harper cursed behind her and gave chase, but Jessica was faster. She grabbed the ladder and hauled herself up with everything she had. She could hear him gaining on her, his footsteps heavy and relentless, but she didn't look back. She climbed with frantic energy, her hands slipping on the rusted metal, her muscles screaming in protest, but she kept going. She reached the top of the building just as Harper reached the bottom of the ladder. He shouted her name, but Jessica didn't hesitate. She wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. From the rooftop, the city sprawled out below her, the distant hum of traffic a reminder that the world kept turning, even as she fought for her life. She was high above the streets now, but she still wasn't safe. Evelyn and Harper weren't far behind. She could feel their presence, like a storm on the horizon. With no time to lose, she sprinted across the roof. her feet pounding against the gravel surface. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but every direction seemed to lead back to them. There had to be another way. There had to be something she wasn't seeing. Then she spotted it. A narrow alleyway between two buildings. It wasn't much of a chance, but it was a chance. Without a second thought, she darted toward it, slipping between the buildings with barely an inch to spare. She could hear Harper's voice, low and furious, shouting orders to someone. Evelyn wasn't far behind. She kept moving, her heart thundering in her chest as she slipped through the alley and onto another street. She had no idea where she was going, but she didn't care. She just had to keep moving. But as she turned another corner, she ran straight into someone. The collision knocked her back, and she stumbled, falling to the ground. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. Her heart, her breath, the world around her. She looked up to see a tall man standing in front of her, his face obscured by a dark hood. He reached down and grabbed her by the arm, pulling her up with surprising strength. "Come with me," he said, his voice low and urgent. Jessica's mind raced. She had no idea who this man was, but she had no choice but to trust him. Harper and Evelyn were too close. She couldn't afford to hesitate. Before she could react, the man grabbed her hand and pulled her into an alley, moving quickly and silently. Jessica's heart raced in her chest, her mind screaming at her to keep up. She had no idea where he was taking her, but it was better than the alternative. They ran through the alleyways, the city streets a blur around them. Jessica's legs burned, but the adrenaline kept her going. She didn't look back, didn't dare to. The man led her to a small, nondescript building tucked away between two larger structures. He stopped in front of a door, glancing around quickly before pulling out a set of keys and unlocking the door. "Get inside," he urged, pushing the door open and gesturing for her to enter. Jessica hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The door clicked shut behind her, and she was engulfed in the darkness of the unfamiliar building. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer immediately. He was too busy locking the door behind him and checking the windows. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "You're safe for now, but they're not going to stop looking for you." Jessica's chest tightened. She had no idea who this man was, but one thing was clear. He wasn't one of them. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't completely alone. The dim light of the small room did little to ease the weight of the silence that hung between them. Jessica's pulse was still racing, her mind running in circles as she tried to make sense of everything that had happened. The stranger hadn't said much since they entered the building, and she was left with more questions than answers. Who was he? Why had he helped her? She looked around the room. It was small, sparsely furnished, with a few mismatched chairs and an old wooden table covered in papers. The faint scent of something burning, maybe incense or old candles, lingered in the air. The room had the feel of a place that was used only when necessary, a hideout of sorts. The man was standing by the window, peering out with a careful, almost calculating expression on his face. She could see his silhouette against the faint light of the street outside. He hadn't introduced himself, and Jessica wasn't sure if she should ask. Instead, she took a cautious step toward him. "Who are you?" He didn't look at her, but his lips curled into a small, tight smile. "You can call me John," he replied without turning away from the window. "For now." "Why did you help me?" Jessica asked, her voice low, but firm. "What do you want from me?" John finally turned to face her, his eyes steady, almost too steady. "I don't want anything from you," he said, his voice calm. "I just want to make sure you don't end up in the wrong hands." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "And you think I'm in the wrong hands?" "Your enemies are close. Too close. And they're not going to stop until they get what they want." She felt a chill run down her spine. The words were blunt, direct. Harper and Evelyn were ruthless. She had seen that firsthand, felt the coldness of their control. But hearing it from someone else, someone who seemed to know so much about her situation, made the danger all the more real. "What do they want?" she asked, though she already had an idea. John's eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing how much to say. "They want control, power, and you're standing in the way of that. You don't realize it yet, But they need you. Jessica frowned. Why me? I don't have anything they need. John stepped away from the window, crossing the room toward her. You'd be surprised, he said, his voice low, almost like a warning. Harper and Evelyn aren't just after money or influence. They're after something much more valuable. And you're the key. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, and Jessica felt a growing sense of unease. The more John spoke, the less she understood. What could she possibly have that was so important to them? You still don't get it, do you? John said, almost as if reading her mind. He walked past her and reached for a stack of papers on the table. As he spread them out, Jessica noticed photographs of her, of Harper, of Evelyn, and several documents, all filled with cryptic notes and markings. Everything they've done, John continued, has been part of a bigger plan, and you're tangled right in the middle of it. Jessica stepped closer to the table, her eyes scanning the papers. There were images of meetings, locations, and times, things she didn't recognize, things she hadn't been a part of. But her name appeared several times, connected to a series of events that seemed to lead back to her in some way. What is all this? She asked, her voice trembling with a mix of confusion and fear. This, John said, pointing to a particular document, is where it all begins. Your involvement. You've been targeted for a reason, Jessica. Whether you like it or not, you're a part of this. She swallowed hard, trying to wrap her head around what he was saying. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't asked to be pulled into their world of lies and manipulation. But now that she was here, trapped in a web of their making, it seemed like there was no way out. They've been following you for a while, John continued, watching her carefully, but they won't stop. Not until they get what they want. What do they want from me? She repeated, her voice a little more desperate now. John didn't immediately answer. Instead, he moved to the door and peered out through the cracks in the blinds. Jessica could see his face tense, the muscles in his jaw clenching. They want to control you, Jessica, he said quietly, his tone turning serious. And if they can't control you, they'll destroy you. Jessica's breath hitched in her chest. The weight of his words pressed down on her, and for the first time, she wondered if she had been out of her depth from the very beginning. She had thought she could handle this. Fight back, get out. But what if she couldn't? What if they were too powerful? You're not alone in this, John added, as if reading her thoughts. I'm not going to let them get to you. Jessica looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. But there was none. He seemed completely certain, his resolve unshaken. How do you know all this? She asked. Who are you really? John gave her a small, enigmatic smile. I'm someone who's been watching them for a long time, and I know exactly how dangerous they are. Jessica was silent for a long moment, the room feeling colder now than it had before. She didn't know whether to trust John, or if he was just another player in a much bigger game. But right now, he was the only one who seemed to care about keeping her safe. I don't know who to trust anymore, she said quietly, but I can't let them win. You won't, John said firmly. Not if I have anything to say about it. For the first time in what felt like weeks, Jessica allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. There was someone who might be able to help, someone who understood what she was up against. But even as the hope rose within her, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far darker than she could imagine. The quiet hum of the city outside seemed so far removed from the tension inside the room. Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away, that something big was about to happen, and she didn't know if she was ready for it. She glanced at John, who was now standing near the window again, his gaze fixed on the street below. The eerie stillness in his posture gave away nothing. Was he waiting for something? Or someone? I've been thinking, Jessica said, breaking the silence, her voice unsure. About what you said. About why they're after me. John didn't respond immediately, but his eyes flicked toward her, then back to the street. He remained silent, as if weighing the significance of her words. Why me, John? She repeated, stepping closer. Why would they want someone like me involved in whatever this is? I don't even know what's going on. John's face remained expressionless, but there was something in the way he carried himself that suggested he wasn't as unaffected as he appeared. He was waiting for the right moment. Jessica knew he wouldn't say more until he was ready. They have been planning this for a long time, he said finally, his voice low and deliberate. You weren't the first target, but you're the one who's in the right place at the right time. And they've already made sure that there's no turning back for you. For either of us. Jessica's heart skipped. She had no idea what he meant by that. What do you mean, no turning back? She asked, her voice thick with unease. John's gaze turned toward the floor, his hand tightening around the edge of the windowsill. When he spoke again, his voice was tinged with a bitterness she hadn't expected. I've been tracking them for years. Harper, Evelyn, their entire operation. But now, it's personal. His eyes met hers, burning with intensity. They know too much about me, about my past, about the things I've done, and they found a way to make me pay for it. Jessica felt a chill at his words, but she didn't interrupt. She wanted to know more. You don't know who you're dealing with, John continued, his voice almost a whisper. They've infiltrated every part of the system. The law, the government, the media. It doesn't matter where you go. They're everywhere. And the reason they're after you is the same reason they've been after me. Which is? Jessica asked, her mind racing. The truth, John said simply. We're both part of a bigger truth. A truth they don't want anyone to know. A truth they've been trying to bury for years. The room felt colder as the weight of his words sank in. Jessica could sense the gravity of what John was saying, though she didn't fully understand the implications. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that stretched back further than she could comprehend. But why me? What's the connection? She asked, desperation creeping into her voice. What do they want from me? John exhaled sharply, rubbing his eyes as if to stave off exhaustion. You're part of the key, Jessica. They need you because of something you don't even know you have. Something they've been hunting for years. They're not just after power. They're after something more dangerous. A truth, hidden away, buried so deep that only a few people even know it exists. And you're the key to unlocking it. Jessica stood frozen, her mind spinning. She had been so focused on just getting out alive, on escaping from Harper and Evelyn's grasp, that she hadn't thought about any bigger scheme at play. But now it seemed like her own survival wasn't just tied to her escape. It was tied to something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. John, she started, but he raised his hand to silence her. They'll come for you soon, he said. I can't protect you forever. You have to leave this place. You have to disappear. Jessica felt a knot form in her stomach. Disappear? What do you mean? Where am I supposed to go? John hesitated for a moment before answering. I know a place. A safe house, far from here. You'll be able to stay off the radar for a while. Long enough to figure out how to fight back. How to stop them. Stop them? Jessica echoed, her voice tinged with disbelief. How am I supposed to do that? John's eyes locked onto hers, his expression hardening. You've already been pulled into their game, Jessica. But you're not a pawn. You're the one who can take control of this. You're the one who can expose them for what they really are. But you have to make a choice. You either run and hope they don't find you, or you fight and take them down for good. The air in the room grew thick with tension, and Jessica felt her heart pound harder in her chest. The choice seemed impossible, but she knew, deep down, that there was no going back. No matter what she chose, there would be no easy way out. I don't know if I'm ready for this, she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. John's expression softened, just for a moment. No one ever is, he said quietly. But sometimes there's no choice. You fight or you fall. Jessica's mind was racing. She thought of her family, her life before all of this chaos. And then she thought of Harper and Evelyn. Their cold eyes, their manipulative smiles, the way they had used her as a pawn in their dangerous game. Could she really take them down? Could she really fight back? She looked at John, searching his face for the answers she didn't have. He was offering her a way out, another chance at survival. But was it worth the risk? Would it cost her everything? There's no turning back now, John said, breaking her train of thought. You've already crossed the line, Jessica. You're either in this fight or you're out. And there's only one way out. Jessica took a deep breath. This wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't about running. She was already in the fight. It was time to end it. The safe house was a small, nondescript house tucked away on the edge of town. It was the kind of place you'd pass by without a second thought, the kind that blended into the background of ordinary life. Jessica couldn't help but wonder how many others had passed through here, how many secrets the walls held. As she stepped inside, John closed the door behind them with a soft click, sealing them off from the world outside. The house felt strangely empty, but not in a desolate way. Instead, it felt like a place that had been designed for people who needed to disappear. "Stay here for a while," John said, his voice distant as he set down his bag. "I need to go check something out. Make sure it's safe." Jessica nodded, though the fear gnawing at her insides didn't abate. There was a sense of finality to everything now. She wasn't just running from Harper and Evelyn anymore. She was diving headfirst into a battle that might cost her everything. But she didn't have a choice. She had already made the decision. John's figure disappeared into the shadows of the house, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The silence was suffocating. Jessica sat down on the small couch in the living room, trying to make herself comfortable despite the tension in her body. She ran her hands over her face, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling in. She had barely slept since everything had started. Her phone buzzed suddenly, cutting through the stillness. She jumped, her heart racing, before she glanced at the screen. The number was unrecognized. Her hand hovered over the screen for a moment before she answered. "Hello?" she said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment, Jessica wondered if it was a wrong number. Then the voice came through, low and clipped, sending a chill down her spine. "I know where you are." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. "Who is this?" The voice on the other end chuckled softly, but there was nothing warm in it. "You don't need to know who I am. What matters is that I know where you are, and I can make sure you never leave." Jessica's grip on the phone tightened. The threat was unmistakable. She glanced around the room, as though the walls themselves could offer her some protection, but there was nowhere to hide. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "What do you want from me?" The voice remained cold. "It's not about what I want. It's about what you're too blind to see. You've already made your move. You've already crossed the line. And now it's too late." The line went dead. Jessica stared at the phone, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the walls closing in around her. Whoever this was, they knew where she was, and they weren't bluffing. She stood up, pacing the small room. What was she supposed to do now? Should she wait for John to return, or should she take matters into her own hands? She couldn't stay here, not with the threat hanging over her head. But if she ran, where could she go? The door creaked open, and Jessica spun around, her pulse racing. It was only John, stepping inside, his face grim as he closed the door behind him. "What happened?" he asked, noticing the tension in her body. I got a call," Jessica said, her voice trembling. "Someone knows where we are. They said it's too late. That I've already crossed the line." John's face darkened. "Who was it?" "I don't know. The number was unrecognized," Jessica replied. "But they knew where I was. They said I wouldn't make it out." John cursed under his breath. He took a step toward her, his eyes scanning the room with a calculating look. "It doesn't matter who it was," he said, his voice low and firm. "They're trying to scare you. They know we're here. But this doesn't change anything. We're still going to finish what we started." "John, I don't know if I can do this," Jessica whispered, her voice breaking. "What if they're right? What if it really is too late?" John placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle despite the urgency in his voice. "Listen to me, Jessica. You're stronger than you think. You've made it this far, haven't you? You're not just some pawn in their game. You're the one who holds the power now. You're the one who can take them down." Jessica met his gaze, searching his eyes for reassurance. He was right. She had made it this far. She'd survived more than she ever thought possible. But this was different. The stakes were higher now. The enemy was closing in. "What do we do next?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John's expression hardened. "We do what we've always done. We fight back." He turned to the bag he'd set down earlier, rummaging through it before pulling out a small, sleek laptop. He opened it and began typing quickly, his eyes focused on the screen. "You need to be ready," he continued, not looking up. "They're going to come for us soon, and we need to be prepared. This is your chance to take control of the situation. You're the one who can expose them all, Harper, Evelyn, everyone involved. But it's going to take everything you've got." Jessica nodded, trying to steady her breathing. The weight of what he was saying was overwhelming, but deep down, she knew it was true. The only way out was through. There was no escaping this, no running. She was in it now, for better or worse. "Tell me what I need to do," she said, her voice steady with resolve. John looked at her, his eyes gleaming with the same determination. "Get ready, Jessica. This is only the beginning." The air in the small house felt thick, as if the walls were closing in. Jessica could feel her pulse thrumming in her ears, the quiet hum of the laptop in front of her almost drowned out by the chaos brewing inside her mind. John's instructions were clear. She had to act and fast. But with every passing second, doubt began to creep in. She had been running for so long, dodging one danger after another. The idea of exposing the truth, of standing face to face with the people who had manipulated and controlled her life for so long, filled her with a cold fear. She wasn't just fighting for her life now. She was fighting for justice, for the lives of everyone who had suffered at the hands of Harper and Evelyn. Jessica looked over at John, who was still typing away furiously on the laptop. He was right. This was the only way forward. She had to take control. She had to stop running. "John," she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "What if they're expecting us? What if we're walking right into their trap?" John paused, glancing up at her with a hard, unreadable expression. "They're already hunting us. If we sit here and wait for the next move, we'll be dead before we ever make a dent. The only way to win is to force their hand." She could see the resolve in his eyes, and it gave her the smallest sense of reassurance. If John believed they could do this, then maybe, just maybe, it was possible. But that didn't make the plan any less terrifying. "How?" she asked, swallowing her fear. "What do we do?" John's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he spoke again, his voice steady. "We start by getting the evidence. We need everything they've been hiding. Their connections, their financial backdoor deals. Everything that proves they're guilty. Once we have that, we expose them to the world." Jessica nodded, steeling herself for the task ahead. The time for hesitation was over. The truth needed to be brought to light, no matter the cost. "We have to move quickly," John continued, turning the laptop toward her so she could see the screen. "I've already gained access to one of their private servers. There's a file here with everything we need, bank transfers, confidential contracts, the works. If we can get it to the right people, we can take them down for good." The file was a sea of numbers and names, foreign in its complexity, but Jessica could feel a deep sense of purpose settle over her as she began to read through the documents. This was it. This was what they had been working toward all this time. The truth was buried here, hidden behind layers of deceit. "We can't mess this up," Jessica said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anxiety and determination. "If we get caught with this, they'll kill us," John finished for her. "But we don't have a choice. This is our best shot." Her fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up the documents John had accessed. She started scanning through them, reading every word with intense concentration. The data was overwhelming, but her eyes never wavered from the screen. She had to get it right. They both did. A sudden sound outside made her freeze. It was faint at first, just the crunch of gravel beneath tires, but it was enough to send a spike of adrenaline rushing through her veins. John's hand went to the gun at his waist. "They're here," he whispered. Jessica's heart hammered in her chest as she looked toward the door. She could hear the low rumble of voices, the sound of footsteps approaching. Whoever they were getting closer. "This is it," Jessica said, her voice tight with panic. "What do we do now?" John didn't hesitate. "We're not done yet. You stay here and finish what you started. I'll buy us some time." "No," Jessica said sharply. "I'm not staying behind. If this goes south, I'm not letting you take the fall alone." John gave her a look, his expression hard but understanding. "I'm not asking you to. I just need you to stay focused." The moment you have the evidence, send it. Don't wait for me. Jessica nodded, though the pit in her stomach deepened. This was it. There was no turning back now. She turned back to the screen, trying to ignore the rising tension in her chest as the footsteps outside grew louder. Every second felt like an eternity. She was so close, just a little more time, and she'd have everything they needed. The door slammed open, and Jessica's heart stopped. She spun around to see two men entering the room, their faces cold and unreadable. They were dressed in black, tactical gear, their eyes scanning the room with a predatory intensity. Behind them, Jessica could make out more figures in the distance. Harper's men, no doubt. "Stay where you are," one of the men barked, his voice hard and commanding. John stepped forward, blocking Jessica's view of the intruders. "You're too late," he said, his voice calm but laced with a dangerous edge. "We've already won." The man scoffed. "Is that so? We'll see about that." With lightning speed, John reached for the gun, but the man was faster. He lunged forward, grabbing John's wrist and twisting it sharply. The gun fell to the floor with a clatter. "Get on the ground," the man ordered, his voice cold and merciless. Jessica's mind raced. She had to act now. She couldn't let them take John. She couldn't let them destroy everything they'd worked for. Her eyes darted to the laptop. The evidence. She had to send it. In a blur of motion, Jessica grabbed the laptop and slammed it shut, her heart pounding in her chest as she stood up. "John, no!" she screamed, but he was already on the ground, struggling against the men who were restraining him. Without thinking, Jessica bolted for the door, clutching the laptop to her chest. She could hear them yelling behind her, but she didn't look back. She ran, faster than she ever had before, her body fueled by pure adrenaline. It was now or never. The night air was cool, the kind of chill that made her breath visible in the darkness. Jessica's lungs burned as she ran, the gravel path underfoot seeming to stretch endlessly before her. Every step was a heartbeat, and every heartbeat was a countdown. Behind her, she could hear the shouts of Harper's men growing more distant, but she didn't dare slow down. She couldn't afford to. The laptop clutched tightly to her chest felt like a weight that might crush her, but she refused to let go. The evidence inside it wasn't just data. It was her ticket to exposing the truth, to finally ending the reign of terror that Harper and Evelyn had imposed on her life, and countless others. She turned the corner of the street and pressed her back against the cold brick wall of a nearby building. Breathing heavily, she listened for the sounds of pursuit, her eyes scanning the night. Everything around her seemed to hold its breath. A distant siren wailed, but it wasn't close enough to offer any real comfort. The police had their own battles to fight. This was on her. She had to do this herself. Quickly, she fumbled with the laptop, managing to open it with shaky fingers. The documents she had seen earlier flashed on the screen, and for a moment, she felt like she was drowning in the enormity of it all. But she couldn't stop now. Her eyes flicked to the icon she needed, the one that would send the files to a secure server John had set up earlier, one where they would be retrieved by the authorities and media outlets who could ensure Harper and Evelyn would be exposed. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Just a few keystrokes. But then her phone buzzed in her pocket. Jessica's stomach dropped. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she pulled the phone free, hoping for some miracle. It was a text from John. "They know. Be careful. Don't trust anyone. They're on their way." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been too focused on getting the evidence out that she hadn't even thought about the possibility of betrayal. She knew Harper had a vast network of contacts, people who would stop at nothing to protect his empire. Jessica's pulse quickened. She had to make a choice. A hard choice. The authorities couldn't be trusted to act quickly enough. The files had to be sent to someone who could make the truth go viral. She needed to find a journalist, someone outside the system who wasn't in Harper's pocket. With one final glance over her shoulder, she stood up, her breath shallow and quick. She had one chance, and she couldn't waste it. Her mind raced as she thought of the names of potential reporters who had a reputation for being fearless in the face of danger. That's when she remembered. Emily Carter. Emily had covered major stories about corruption and injustice in the past. She had the resources to expose Harper's empire to the world. Jessica's hands shook as she typed Emily's contact information into her phone. As she hit send, a car screeched around the corner, its headlights blinding her for a moment. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. They had found her. Without another thought, she bolted toward an alley, her feet pounding the pavement in rhythm with her racing heart. She couldn't look back now, not until she was safe. Her phone buzzed again. It was Emily. Got your message. We're already live. Stay hidden. I'll handle the rest. For the first time in what felt like ages, Jessica let herself breathe. Emily was going to expose the truth. The world would finally know who Harper and Evelyn really were. But that didn't mean the fight was over. As Jessica ducked behind a dumpster to catch her breath, she could hear the sounds of distant engines revving. She didn't need to see the men to know they were getting closer, and she couldn't keep running forever. It wasn't long before a car pulled up to the end of the alley. Four men stepped out, their silhouettes framed by the harsh headlights. One of them was holding a gun, and the others were scanning the area with military precision. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest. They had found her. She could fight. She could run. But it wouldn't matter. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making sure Harper and Evelyn paid for everything they had done. And that meant taking a stand. Without thinking, Jessica stepped out from behind the dumpster, her stance confident and resolute. She held up the laptop, displaying the encrypted files on the screen. "Do your worst," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "The world will see you for who you really are." The man holding the gun took a step toward her, but his expression faltered when he saw the files on the screen. For a split second, the tension in the air hung as thick as smoke. Then, as if on cue, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Dozens of police cars turned the corner, their flashing lights illuminating the street. Jessica knew that Emily had made it happen. The files had already been broadcasted, sent out to every major news network. And with that, the cavalry had arrived. The man with the gun hesitated, looking between Jessica and the incoming officers. The other men backed away slowly, realizing they were no longer in control. It was over.